On the evening of Wednesday, September 24, 2003, 45-year-old Michael Albert Dohaquez laid down flat on his back on his yoga mat in front of a room full of his students at a yoga studio in downtown Tucson, Arizona. The students all followed Michael's lead, laying down for a pose called Shavasana, which signaled the end of a long workout. Michael loved this final pose because it was all about meditation, and it really helped him get centered for his day. And after a few minutes in this pose, when he sat up and told his students to rise as well, he felt both exhausted and recharged. He got to his feet and smiled at his class as everyone else rolled up their yoga mats and got ready to leave. Although Michael was a machinist by trade and spent his workdays in his shop tinkering with tools and small engines, he was actually a very artistic and kind of zen person. He spent his free time giving music lessons on his guitar, and he also taught 15 different yoga classes every week in various gyms and studios all across Tucson. His genuine enthusiasm about the physical, mental, and spiritual benefits of yoga were very infectious, and it put many of his students at ease around him. In fact, they were so comfortable with him that they called him MAD, which was short for his three initials, Michael Albert Dohaquez. Michael toweled the sweat off his face and looked up at the clock on the wall. It was almost 7 p.m., and his stomach was beginning to rumble. So he asked the class, as they were getting ready to go, if anybody was feeling up to grabbing some food and a few drinks, which was actually a question they were all expecting, because hanging out socially was something that this Wednesday group typically did each week after their workout. One student immediately shouted out that they would, and a few others raised their hands as well. So Michael suggested they all meet at a bar on 4th Avenue, not far from where the yoga studio was located. The students that were going all nodded their heads in agreement, and then all of them, the ones who were going and the ones who were not, all shuffled through the studio's door and outside to the parking lot. But before Michael shut off the studio lights and followed the group outside, he picked up his cell phone and called his girlfriend, Amber Trudell. He'd been seeing her off and on for about a year after first meeting her through his yoga lessons. Recently, things had been a bit rocky between Amber and Michael, but Michael still wanted to invite her out for dinner and drinks. He figured that by having her be a part of a big group setting out at a public place, that would sort of give them a chance to have fun without the opportunity to argue, since if they argued, it would be in front of everyone, so that was a natural deterrent. After a few rings, Amber answered her phone, and Michael told her very enthusiastically about his plans and said that he would love it if she came out with them. But Amber hesitated, and Michael frankly knew why. In addition to the problems they were having in their relationship, Amber was just a very shy person. She preferred private lessons with Michael rather than being a part of a big group where you had all these other people sort of watching you stretch for an hour. But after a few seconds of awkward silence on the line, Amber said that she actually would meet up with Michael and his students at the bar. Michael was thrilled and told Amber he would see her there. Then he ended the call, shut off the lights in the studio, and walked out the door into the parking lot, thinking about Amber. Michael and Amber were opposites, but that didn't really bother Michael. It also didn't bother him when Amber teased him about how he dressed like a hippie with his long hair and beaded necklace and sandals. Michael could take a joke, and above all, he liked to have fun, which in his mind was what he was doing with an attractive woman like Amber, who was actually 17 years younger than he was. Their relationship really was pretty casual, and Michael intended to keep it that way. He'd been married twice already, and was a father to 3 kids, as well as a grandfather. And at this point in his life, he did not want to be tied down anymore. Amber, on the other hand, she did want to get serious. She kept asking Michael to marry her, and every few weeks, she'd break up with him for saying no. And so Michael knew that their relationship status would likely come up tonight in conversation. But since there were other people going out with them, he figured maybe he could dodge an argument about it. A few minutes later, Michael walked into the bar on 4th Street and found 5 of his students already sitting at a table. He sat down and ordered a drink, and shortly after that, Michael looked up to see Amber walk in through the front door of the bar. He stood up from the table, gave her a big hug, and then invited her to take a spot right next to him. From that point on, the group ordered some food, and they drank and talked and goofed around until around 8:30 at night when folks started getting tired. At that point, they all paid their checks, and then they left. Now, most of the students were heading home at this point, but Michael, Amber, and one of the students, Michael's friend Eli, decided to continue their night and go have a few more drinks at another bar. So the 3 of them went to another establishment until around 10 p.m. And at that point, Eli decided it was time for him to call it a night. He took some cash from his wallet, put it down on the table, and then he headed home, leaving just Michael and Amber at the bar. And now that the couple was all alone, just as Michael expected, they began to fight. And so Michael began drinking faster and ordering more drinks for Amber, hoping that maybe more alcohol for both of them would mellow them out. 2 hours later, at midnight, when the bartender turned the lights off and then back on again and then announced out loud it was last call, both Michael and Amber were pretty drunk. Michael yawned, finished the rest of the drink in his glass, and asked Amber to come back to his house with him. She said she would, and so Michael and Amber paid their tab and then walked out the front door into the night. Shortly afterwards, the two of them stumbled up the walkway and onto the front porch of Michael's house at 2602 North Sparkman Boulevard. Michael unlocked the door, and then he and Amber stepped into the kitchen. A day and a half later, on Friday, September 26th, at around 6:30 in the morning, a woman was walking her dog along North Sparkman Boulevard in Tucson. The street was in a pretty rough neighborhood where there were lots of burglaries and muggings, and so most people kind of kept to themselves when they were passing through. Usually, the woman walked her dog at a fast pace with her head down, avoiding eye contact with other pedestrians and avoiding looking into other people's properties. However, when the woman passed in front of number 2602, something caught her attention. Just beyond some brush obscuring the front patio, she saw a flash of something light-colored that was obviously not vegetation. She turned her head to look and blinked for a second in confusion, because what she was looking at didn't make sense. It was a person's bare legs in shorts splayed out on the patio. Now, the weather had been excruciatingly hot and muggy and stifling for the last few days, including today, so the woman at first thought that maybe this person up on the porch had passed out from the heat. Now, as soon as she thought that, her first instinct was to walk up and investigate and make sure this person was okay. But since this was not really a safe neighborhood, the idea of just strolling up to some stranger's property seemed kind of risky. But just then, she saw another man walking on the street towards his car, and she called out to him and pointed over at the legs on the patio and asked if he would go see what was the matter. The man looked over at the house and saw what the woman was pointing at and sort of looked puzzled for a second. Then he turned back to the woman and gave a thumbs up, like, "Yep, I'll go check it out." Then the man walked over to the porch. The woman watched as the man walked up to the porch, and right as he got close to the legs, he called out the name Michael. And then the man who was doing this checkup, he began backing up, and then he turned and actually started running back towards the woman, and as he passed her, he just said, "I'm calling 911. Not long after that man called 911, Detective Ben Jimenez of the Tucson Police Department drove down North Sparkman Boulevard in his cruiser. He came to a stop just outside of number 2602, put his cruiser in park, and cut the engine. Around him, he saw other squad cars and ambulances doing the same thing. Jimenez stepped out of his air-conditioned cruiser into the hot, muggy morning air. He took off his suit jacket and tossed it onto the driver's seat, and then shut the door. He rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, loosened his tie, and then walked from the curb up to the porch of the house, until he was standing next to the dead body of a man who was lying face up and wearing yoga pants and a tank top. Jimenez was not the first member of the Tucson PD on the scene, and one of the other officers who was already there told him that the body he was looking at belonged to the home's resident, who was named Michael Dohaquez. The officer told Jimenez that the rest of the property was empty. Michael was their only victim. Jimenez put on a pair of disposable gloves and squatted down next to the body. He could see there was a single bullet wound in the center of Michael's forehead. Around the bullet wound, Jimenez could see a black star-shaped gunpowder burn. There was lots of dried blood on the porch floor around the head, and more blood on Michael's clothes and legs. Jimenez mentioned to the officer to be on the lookout for any shell casings. Then Jimenez put his hand up to Michael's exposed skin and found that it was actually still warm. The fact the body had not gone cold yet suggested that Michael may have been killed only a few hours earlier, probably in the early hours of Friday morning. Jimenez looked at Michael's hands and saw that they were covered in scratches, which told him that Michael very likely must have fought with his attacker. Jimenez stood back up, but just as he was about to walk inside the house, he stopped, because he noticed that some guitar and violin cases were haphazardly stacked up outside on the porch. And this struck him as odd, because nobody in this neighborhood would ever store expensive musical equipment outside, or really anything sort of like obviously expensive outside, because it could get stolen. But regardless, Jimenez stepped through the front door and into the kitchen, and as he did, he saw more music gear. This time it was an amplifier and a guitar stand that had been left to the side of the door just inside the house. On the floor near the gear, Jimenez saw broken glass from a shattered window pane. And so already, Jimenez was beginning to develop a theory. He wondered if maybe Michael had interrupted a robbery. Maybe the thief or thieves had been in the process of shuffling the musical equipment out of the house onto the porch, kind of stacking it up near the door as they were doing it, when Michael came out and confronted them. The broken glass in the kitchen suggested that the fight maybe started there, or at least in part happened right there, and then from there, they moved through the door onto the porch where Michael was ultimately shot. And then when Jimenez did a walkthrough of the rest of the property, he found in Michael's workshop that it was perfectly intact and none of the very obviously expensive tools had been taken or moved. And so to Jimenez, this cemented his theory that very likely Michael had interrupted a robbery. And so very likely, at least according to Jimenez's theory, after the robber shot Michael, he figured that they must have panicked and then just taken off without finishing the job. By this point, the crime scene was swarming with members of the forensics unit and also uniformed officers. Jimenez knew it would take hours to process the scene for blood, fingerprints, and other trace evidence, and also officers were already out knocking on doors in the neighborhood looking for witnesses. So Jimenez decided to leave and go talk to detectives in the burglary division to see if they had any similar cases or usual suspects. Back inside of headquarters, Detective Jimenez walked quickly to the burglary division. He rapped on the open door of one of the offices there and caught the attention of a detective at a desk. Jimenez explained the case he just caught, laid out his theory about a home robbery gone wrong, and then asked the detective if he had any recent robberies on or around North Sparkman Boulevard. And the second Jimenez mentioned North Sparkman Boulevard, he saw this detective's eyes light up. He shot straight up in his chair and very excitedly said that yes, he did in fact have something. Just 5 days earlier, on Sunday, he had arrested 2 men, Joseph Keyes and David Wynn, for robbing a home in that exact same neighborhood. But that wasn't all. First of all, Keyes and Wynn lived in a house that was just a mile away from Michael's place, and, most importantly, one of the items these 2 men had stolen was a guitar. Jimenez knew this was a great starting point, so he got Keyes and Wynn's home address from the detective. Then Jimenez returned to his own desk and began filling out an application for a search warrant. While he waited for a judge to approve his request, Jimenez's phone rang. It was one of the officers who'd been knocking on doors over on North Sparkman Boulevard. The officer told Jimenez that nobody in the area heard any gunshots or any unusual noises coming from Michael's house early on Friday morning. And nobody seemed to have seen Michael at all for a day or two. However, one neighbor told police that on Thursday afternoon, Michael must have been working in his workshop because they'd heard his compressor going. So, the neighborhood canvass had not produced a witness to the killing, but they were starting to build a picture of Michael's final hours. Jimenez thanked the officer for the good work and hung up the phone, feeling satisfied. Less than 1 full day into his investigation, and he already had a very promising working theory, he had a search warrant application out to a judge, and he was refining, his victim's final moments to really get a sense of what actually happened here. But for now, it was late in the evening, and he knew he had a long day ahead of him tomorrow. So he shut down his computer and left his office. The next morning was Saturday, and Detective Jimenez arrived at his office to find that his search warrant application for the home of Joseph Keyes and David Wynn had been approved. He also found a copy of the autopsy report waiting for him, along with a couple of reports from other detectives who had begun to reach out to Michael's friends and family. Now, Jimenez was very eager to go search Wynn and Keyes' house, but first he picked up the autopsy report, flipped it open, and gave it a quick read. The coroner had found a .38 caliber bullet lodged in Michael's brain. The star-shaped gunpowder burn around the entry wound meant it had been fired at close range, which Jimenez had already guessed. And also the coroner noted that the wounds on Michael's hands were indeed very likely defensive wounds. The most useful part of the report focused on Michael's time of death. When Jimenez got to the scene and he touched Michael's body, it was warm to the touch, and so he had assumed that very likely Michael had died recently. Jimenez just didn't know exactly when. And the coroner was able to confirm that suspicion. Because Michael had not yet gone through rigor mortis, the coroner was able to establish an actual time of death. Michael had been shot somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m. on Friday morning. And so this information meant that Jimenez could be very specific when he was investigating suspect alibis. This was great news. Jimenez rifled through the other reports, which laid out a rough timeline of Michael's activities before his death. He had taught a yoga class on Wednesday night and gone out for drinks afterwards with some students and a girlfriend who Michael's friends knew only as Amber. Then on Thursday, he'd apparently spent the entire day holed up inside of his studio working. Jimenez put the reports down. He'd have to work on tracking down Amber later, but for now, that was not his priority. Instead, he gathered up a team of officers and drove over to the home of Joseph Keyes and David Wynn. When they got there, they knocked on the door, they didn't get an answer, and so eventually they forced their way inside, and immediately they discovered that there was nobody home. However, pretty quickly, once Jimenez walked into the kitchen, he knew coming to this house had put him on the right track, because in the kitchen, there was this very random-looking pile of clothes. Jimenez put on his gloves, squatted down, and one by one, he picked up a bandana, a pair of pants, and some shoes. And he saw that every item in this pile was splattered with blood. Jimenez was thinking that at this point, all he would need to do to close his case was get these items over to forensics and match the blood on these to the blood of his victim. But the next morning, when Jimenez walked into his office, he got two pieces of bad news, one right after the next. The first piece of bad news was that the forensics did not match. The blood found on the bandana, the pants, and the shoes was the wrong type. It didn't belong to Michael. And the second piece of bad news was that even though Joseph Keyes and David Wynn appeared to be the perfect suspects on paper for this murder, robbery detectives had found one big problem. When Michael was shot early on Friday morning, Keyes and Wynn were both already sitting inside of a jail cell. And so, just 2 days after Michael's body was found, Detective Jimenez found himself back at square one. Jimenez sat at his desk, flipping through reports from the crime scene, and hoping he'd stumble upon a detail that maybe he missed. And after about an hour of doing that, he did find something. On a list of items found inside of Michael's house, Jimenez saw a cell phone. At this time, in 2003, not everybody had a cell phone yet, so it wasn't something police immediately looked for when they arrived on a crime scene. Also, cell phones at this time did not contain the kind of evidence that they would today. There was no internet access on any of them, and people didn't send a whole bunch of text messages or really use them nearly as much as we do now. So Jimenez got up from his desk and walked to the evidence room to get the cell phone. And once he had it, he went straight to the single most useful piece of information the phone contained, and that was the call log. The detective began scrolling through the list of people Michael had spoken to before he died. And at the top of that list was the phone number for a contact listed as Amber Trudell. Jimenez read the name and immediately felt a jolt of excitement. Michael's friends had said that his girlfriend was named Amber. He had meant to track her down, and now he was staring down at, very likely, her phone number. Jimenez took the cell phone and went back to his desk. There, he used his own phone to dial Amber's phone number, but there was no answer. It just rang and finally went to voicemail, which was very disappointing. So Jimenez left a voicemail and asked Amber to please call him back at her earliest convenience. After he hung up, Jimenez just stared at the call history list again. And as he did, he noticed something curious. Michael had been killed on Friday morning, but his last call, which was to Amber, was made on Wednesday night. It seemed bizarre to Jimenez that there was this weird gap in time leading up to Michael's death. It was hard to imagine that all day Thursday, Michael hadn't spoken to anyone. And as he thought about this, he also found it to be kind of suspicious that Amber had not already come forward to talk to the police, considering that her boyfriend had been murdered. And so Jimenez began dialing numbers from Michael's contact list in his phone, including Michael's ex-wives and his adult kids, asking about Amber, looking for any information he could. But it seemed like no one really had any information about who this person was and what her role was in Michael's life. So, by the time Sunday came to a close, Jimenez had a new hunch about where he should focus his investigation: on his victim's girlfriend, Amber. The next morning, on Monday, when Amber still had not returned Jimenez's phone calls, he tried her again. And this time, his call went straight to voicemail instead of ringing like it had the day before. This meant her phone had shut off. Jimenez wasn't sure what to make of this. It was possible that Amber's cell phone had simply run out of batteries. In 2003, that wasn't that unusual to have your phone die and just sort of go without your phone for a while. Also, people did periodically just turn their phone off and not return calls. It was just a different time. But with every hour that went by that day without getting a call back from Amber, Jimenez couldn't help but get more suspicious. Finally, the next day on Tuesday, Jimenez got a phone call. When he picked it up, he hoped it was going to be Amber. But it wasn't Amber. It was Amber's boss, who Jimenez didn't know and had not called. And Amber's boss, who said she had heard about the murder on TV, had a story that changed everything Jimenez thought he knew about this case. The boss said that Amber worked for her as a bookkeeper at a charity called Child and Family Resources, and Amber was usually very reliable. But on Thursday, so a day before the murder, Amber had called out of work for what she said was a family emergency. She had been supposed to return a day ago, on Monday, but she hadn't shown up. And so Jimenez scribbled all this down, thinking that Amber did seem to make a pretty good suspect after all. But then, Amber's boss said there was one more thing. Amber's relationship with Michael was not a typical boyfriend-girlfriend relationship. It was an affair. Amber was married. Less than an hour later, Detective Jimenez walked into the air-conditioned bagel shop where Amber's boss had said that Amber's husband worked. After he had wrapped up the call with Amber's boss, Jimenez was left with a feeling of whiplash. Until her boss had told him about the husband, he had been viewing Amber as a possible suspect, and a good one. But now he was starting to wonder if maybe she was some kind of a victim. After all, right now she was still unaccounted for, nobody had heard from her, and this affair certainly gave her husband a very solid motive to potentially harm her, or harm Michael, or both. All Amber's boss had known about Amber's husband was his name, Justin Goodwin, and his place of employment, this bagel shop. However, when Jimenez asked the employee at the counter if Justin Goodwin was working, the employee looked surprised and kind of nervous, and just shook his head and said no. Then he told Jimenez to wait and left the counter to go into an office in the back. And then after a minute, another man walked out to the counter and introduced himself as the manager. And he told Jimenez that he was sorry, but Justin had worked here, but he quit his job very suddenly just the day before. To Jimenez, it was sort of head-spinning how quickly this new theory that Justin could be involved here was picking up steam. So he asked the manager if he knew anything about Justin's wife, Amber. And the manager made a sort of pained expression. He told Jimenez that all he knew was that their relationship seemed very tumultuous. In fact, Justin had once missed work because he'd been arrested for domestic violence. Jimenez could barely contain his eagerness as he asked the manager for Justin's address. Then, after he got it, he left the bagel shop and sped to the home of his new prime suspect. But when Jimenez arrived, the lights were off in the house. The driveway was empty, and nobody answered the door. And so Jimenez walked around to a few of the nearby houses and spoke to the neighbors, sweating in the heat the whole time, but they all said that they hadn't seen Amber or Justin for at least a few days. Disappointed, Jimenez gave them all his card and asked them to call him if they remembered anything or if they saw or heard anything out of the ordinary. For the next 3 days, Jimenez and his team searched for Amber and Justin and put out notifications to neighboring police departments to be on the lookout for them. But he didn't make any progress until Friday, October 3rd, exactly 1 week after the murder, when one of the neighbors whose doors he had knocked on called him back. It was a woman, and she sounded breathless and excited. She told Jimenez that he had to come back to Justin's house right now, because at this very moment, she was standing at her window and watching as Justin and another man were taking all the furniture out of Justin's home and loading it into a rental van. Jimenez immediately ran out of his office, hopped in his cruiser, and he sped over to Justin's house. And when he got there, he saw a man who he instantly recognized from the mugshots as Justin himself. And just like the neighbor had said, Justin clearly was taking furniture from his house and putting it into this van. Jimenez hopped out of his cruiser, quickly identified himself as a detective, and asked Justin what he was doing and where his wife was. Immediately, Justin looked nervous. He told Jimenez he was moving, which certainly wasn't illegal, and as for his wife, he said he had no idea. He said they were getting a divorce, and she was on her own. Then Justin did something that caught Jimenez totally by surprise. It was swelteringly hot outside, and at some point Justin lifted up his shirt to wipe the sweat off his face. And when he did, Jimenez saw tucked in Justin's waistband was a gun. Now, Jimenez had no idea if Justin had a license to carry this gun, But considering the entire circumstances, it was too much to overlook. And he told Justin he had to come down to the station and answer some questions. Once they were at the station, Jimenez led Justin into an interview room. At this point, the red flags around Justin were almost comically conspicuous. He had been arrested for domestic violence in the past, his wife was having an affair and now she was missing, and her affair partner had been shot to death. Justin had quit his job and cleaned out the house where he and Amber lived, all while armed with a gun. So when Jimenez sat down at the table inside of this interview room, he felt pretty confident that he had his killer right in front of him. Jimenez handed Justin a bottle of water and then began asking him questions, starting with, did he know a man named Michael Dohaquez? Jimenez watched as Justin took the cap off his water and raised it to his mouth before answering, and he saw that Justin's hand was visibly shaking. After a second, Justin just said no, he didn't know anybody by that name. When Jimenez followed up and said that Michael and Amber were having an affair, Justin denied knowing that too. He said that he and Amber clearly were having problems, they were getting a divorce, but those problems had nothing to do with anybody named Michael. He swore again that he really had no idea where Amber was, and insisted that all of the incriminating facts that seemed to surround him were just a coincidence. Right as Jimenez was starting to get frustrated with Justin, feeling like he was blatantly lying to him, there was a knock on the interview room door. Jimenez turned around to see another officer step inside, holding up Justin's cell phone, which they had confiscated along with Justin's gun when they questioned him. The officer apologized for interrupting, but asked Jimenez if he could please step out of the room and speak to him for a moment. Jimenez got up and left the interview room, and the officer handed him Justin's cell phone. He explained that the whole time Jimenez had been questioning Justin, it had been ringing incessantly, and finally he had just picked it up. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman, and she had hung up as soon as he, the officer, had identified himself as police. However, the officer had traced the phone number and found that it belonged to the Extended Stay America Hotel right there in Tucson. Jimenez could not believe his luck. Whoever that was calling Justin, if he could just catch them before they left that hotel, they might be able to give him some real answers about what Justin had been up to for the past few days. So Jimenez asked the officer to keep an eye on Justin because he was going to go track down this mystery caller. A half an hour later, Jimenez was offering a pleasant but very impatient smile to the employee behind the front desk at the Extended Stay America Hotel. The detective had no way of knowing what room the mystery calls had come from, so the employee was looking it up for him, but it was taking forever. Finally, though, the employee looked up and said he did have a woman staying in the room where the calls came from, and the employee said that woman's name was Amber Trudell. Detective Jimenez would take Amber back to the police station and would spend the next several hours untangling her story and Justin's. The detective's murder case was changing faster than he could even keep up with. First, it had looked like a robbery, and he'd had 2 slam-dunk suspects, but that had fallen apart in days. Then he had Amber Trudell, the suspicious girlfriend, who he thought maybe was dodging his calls because she was guilty, but Amber had turned out to be missing, and a possible victim. That revelation had given him Justin Goodwin, the jealous husband, but just as Jimenez had thought he was closing in on Justin for killing Michael and maybe even Amber too, Amber herself had reappeared, holed up in a hotel, and calling Justin over and over again. Whatever Justin and Amber were relationship-wise, they apparently were not totally broken up yet. And so now Jimenez was considering yet another theory, that maybe Justin and Amber had killed Michael together. He figured he could put them both in separate interview rooms, take each of their statements, and then grill them on the inconsistencies that he was absolutely certain he was going to find. But that didn't happen. To Jimenez's shock, Justin and Amber's stories matched each other perfectly. Yes, they said they were having marital problems, and yes, they saw how suspicious all their behavior looked. Between Justin quitting his job and lying to police about where Amber was, and Amber abandoning her job and ignoring all of Jimenez's calls while hiding in a hotel, but they swore they didn't kill Michael, and they had alibis to prove it. Because on Thursday morning, so almost a full 24 hours before the murder, they had left Tucson, headed 3.5 hours north to a mountain town called Sholo, Arizona, where Justin's mother and stepfather lived. They told Jimenez to call Justin's parents and check for himself. And so Jimenez did just that, not really sure what to expect. He didn't really have high hopes here that they were going to actually be able to confirm their alibi. But it would turn out that Justin's stepfather, he was a retired police detective, and he was very straightforward and specific about the timeline. And even though this kind of poked a hole in his whole case, Jimenez believed him. And so this meant that between the hours of 2 and 3 a.m. on Friday, when Michael was shot to death, Amber and Justin were almost 200 miles away. And not only that, but Justin's gun, that had been such a red flag, was not the same caliber as the murder weapon. And so Jimenez's best suspects were just more dead ends. Jimenez let Amber and Justin leave the police station, and he went back to his desk, where he slumped in his chair and stared miserably at nothing. By now, it was late in the day, and Jimenez had no new ideas. His case was turning out to be much more complicated than he had initially thought, and now nothing was making any sense. And so he figured, what he really needed to do now was just take the weekend and look at the case with fresh eyes on Monday. There had to be something he was missing, some piece of evidence that he was either misinterpreting or missing altogether. He decided he would make one more phone call and then head home. He picked up the phone on his desk and dialed the number for the coroner's office. And like he expected, on a Friday night, nobody picked up. So he left a voicemail asking the coroner to take one more look at all the Michael Dohakwa's evidence. He explained he wasn't totally sure what he was looking for, but something just didn't feel right. And he wanted the coroner to look really closely one more time so that he had sort of a good starting point on Monday. Then Jimenez hung up the phone, picked up his jacket, and headed home. The tip that would break this case wide open came early the following week, but the tip didn't come from the coroner. It was a phone call from someone Detective Jimenez had spoken to already in this investigation, and who he never expected to hear from again. This person said that Jimenez had to come meet with them right now, and Jimenez didn't hesitate, because what this person had to say didn't make sense with the rest of the evidence that the detective had. But the detective no longer trusted all of his evidence. He was sure there was something wrong with his facts, he just wasn't sure what it was, and so maybe this was part of it. Jimenez drove out to meet the person who called him, and the person took him for a walk. They said they wanted to show him a hole that they had found in the dirt. And when Jimenez got to that hole, he stood there panting in the warm air, and he realized that finally, he knew who his murderer was. He just had to figure out how this was possible. And this is where the coroner came in. Because shortly after Jimenez got back to the station, the coroner called to tell Jimenez that he had been right. They had all misinterpreted one very important piece of evidence. The truth had been right in front of them all along. They just hadn't put it together. It was 1:30 in the morning, and Michael had just confronted his killer in the messy kitchen of his home. The killer was enraged, and the two of them were standing near the sink, shouting at each other. At some point, the killer grabbed a glass and threw it at Michael, but Michael managed to dodge it, and the glass hit a window pane near the front door, shattering glass all over the ground. Michael was about to step towards the killer to stop them from throwing anything else at him, but there was something he didn't realize. The killer was hiding a revolver. And suddenly the killer drew their weapon, and when Michael saw it, he rushed forward to try to wrench it out of their hands. They struggled, but Michael couldn't get a hold of the gun, and they wrestled together out the front door, and then the killer fired. Michael fell backwards onto the patio, dead. At this point, the killer looked up and down North Sparkman Boulevard to make sure nobody was around, and when they were sure they were good, they took off running into the warm summer night. It would turn out all of Jimenez's suspects, Joseph Keyes, David Wynn, Justin Goodwin, and Amber Trudell, did have alibis for Friday, September 26th, between 2 and 3 a.m., which was when the police thought Michael had been murdered. But law enforcement was wrong about Michael's time of death. The heat had fooled them. Michael was not shot to death early on Friday morning, September 26th. He was shot to death early on Thursday morning, September 25th. His body was warm when Detective Jimenez reached down to touch his skin because it had been very hot and muggy outside the whole time he was lying there. The coroner thought the body temperature, combined with the flexibility of the body, meant that death had been recent and that rigor mortis had not begun. But in reality, a hot and moist environment can cause rigor mortis to happen more quickly after death and last for a shorter period of time. So in reality, Michael's rigor mortis had already come and gone by the time Jimenez touched his body, And so the reason he was sort of flaccid feeling is because he no longer was in rigor mortis. And so when the coroner had gone back over the evidence at Detective Jimenez's request, he found something he had missed. Michael's body had larvae in its eyes, which was an indication that he had been dead for a lot longer than a few hours. And when police went back to the crime scene, they realized that the compressor the neighbor had heard on Thursday, which caused them to think that Michael was alive and well and working in a shop that day, was actually set to refill automatically. So that noise had not meant anything at all. It did not mean that Michael was in there at work. And so the adjustment of the time of death from Friday to Thursday morning allowed Jimenez to make sense of that final phone call he got from the person he had already spoken to, who called him asking to meet. That person was Justin's stepfather, the retired police officer. The stepfather had been telling the truth about the timing of Justin and Amber's visit, and that had ruled them out as suspects when the belief was Michael had been killed on Friday. But after he had gotten off the phone with Jimenez, the stepfather had followed a hunch out to the back of his property where he discovered a hole in the dirt. And inside that hole was the murder weapon. But the person who hid that gun was not Justin. It was his soon-to-be ex-wife, Amber Trudell. On Friday, October 10th, an arrest warrant and a nationwide alert was issued for Amber, who had fled Tucson. U.S. Marshals arrested Amber at her grandmother's house in New York. During her trial in March of 2005, Amber claimed that Michael sexually assaulted her on the night he was killed, and that he himself was actually the one who pulled the trigger during their struggle, which resulted in him being shot and killed. However, she was still convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 13 years in prison. On October 19, 2016, Amber was released from prison, having served out her entire sentence. One day in March of 2012, a 5-year-old girl named Maria sat on the floor of her kitchen in a city in northeast Brazil, eating an empada and watching her aunt cook some stew. An empada is very similar to the empanada in that it is a pie filled with meat, but the empada is the Brazilian version of that pie. Maria's family was actually known for their cooking, specifically their empadas. In fact, at this very moment, Maria's mother was out selling their famous empadas on street corners and in bars and local restaurants. Now, the family got by okay this way, but despite their notoriety around these empadas, they really wanted more. They wanted their family name to be respected, to be powerful. And so to try to make that happen, Maria's family basically worked 24/7. Not just on making empadas, but basically in looking for ways to kind of grow and expand the family name. In fact, while Maria was sitting on the kitchen floor, she could hear her father in the other room working. And the reason she knew he was working is because periodically she could hear him yell out with excitement. He was basically sitting there coming up with ideas of how he could make the family name even bigger and better. And when he had a good idea, he would shout out and be like, "Oh, I found it!" And in addition to constantly sort of brainstorming for ideas of how to become rich and powerful, Maria's father also was an author, and he was writing a book that he was convinced was going to be another thing that would kind of ratchet their family up the social hierarchy. But because Maria's mother and father and basically everybody in her family were so completely immersed in work all the time, it meant they didn't really pay much attention to her. And so most of the time, Maria was just kind of on her own, usually playing in the kitchen or playing in the backyard. Just then, the front door opened and in walked Maria's mother, and she was grinning ear to ear. Not only because she now had an empty tray, meaning she had sold all her empadas, but also she had brought someone along that she was really excited to introduce to Maria. Maria's mom stepped all the way into the kitchen, and right behind her was this young woman. And Maria's mother pointed at this young woman and then gestured for Maria to come over and say hi. And she told Maria that this young woman wants to become her new nanny. And so you guys can play together all the time while me and your father are out doing our work. Maria stood up and gave a shy smile to the young woman, but she wasn't sold that this woman actually would become her nanny. Because in the past, there had been other women who had come by to be her nanny, and they didn't seem to last very long. And so Maria was not getting her hopes up. Still, Maria wanted to be friendly, so she walked over and, as a gesture of goodwill, she handed this woman her half-eaten empada. And the young woman took the empada and laughed and said, "Thank you." After that, Maria's mother told her to head on out back and go play by herself for a bit, while she and this new nanny hammered out the details of her new job. And she told Maria that as soon as they were done, the new nanny would come outside and join her, and they could play together.
And so Maria, who was always very obedient, did as she was told, and she headed out back and entertained herself. And the whole time, as she's just kicking rocks around and pulling grass up and just kind of doing what kids do, she kept looking back at the house, waiting for the nanny to come outside. But she didn't. And after a whole hour had passed by and still this new nanny had not come outside, Maria felt really bored. And so she went inside to go look for her. A month later, Maria was out in her backyard playing by herself like usual when she heard a commotion happening inside of her house. She looked over at the house and couldn't really tell what was going on, and then she heard the sound of her mother and her father and her aunt raising their voices like they were fighting with somebody, and then all of a sudden, these uniformed police officers came charging out the back door towards Maria. One of the officers came right up to her and asked her what her name was, and Maria was so scared, remember she's 5 years old here, that she didn't even know what to say, so she just stood there staring, being totally terrified. She had no idea what was going on. But, as these police officers would soon tell her, it would turn out her entire life was one big, horrific lie. Maria's father, George Silvera, was not actually her father, nor was Maria's mother, Isabel Silvera, her actual mother, nor was her aunt, Bruna Silva, actually her aunt. In reality, those three people were not related to Maria. They were instead members of a cult called the Cartel Sect. And all these three cult members cared about was impressing the members of the cult. When they thought about, making it big, their so-called family name becoming bigger and more powerful, that was all in relationship to the Cartel Sect. They wanted the members of this cult to look at them as the most powerful and important members of that cult. And the way they tried to do that was by performing the duties of this cult to the best of their abilities, better than anybody else in the cult. And so what did this cartel care about? Well, the literal purpose of the Cartel Sect was to eliminate women they deemed unclean in order to reduce and purify the world's population. And Maria's family, the mother, the father, and the aunt, had become very well versed at doing this. All those nannies that came around to see Maria, well, the reason they kept vanishing is because shortly after the mother, the father, and the aunt introduced them to Maria and said, "Oh, she's going to be your new nanny," they would shoo Maria out into the backyard, and then they would murder the nanny because this person had been deemed unclean. They would cut their throats and stab them to death. But that wasn't all. That wasn't enough cleansing. After they murdered these women, they would then butcher them and stuff the human meat into their famous empadas and sell them to the people in town. They literally were feeding people in this city human meat. But the cult and the cannibalism and the murders were not actually the biggest shock of this story. The biggest shock of the story is actually the real identity of little 5-year-old Maria. She was actually the daughter of the very first victim of the Cartel Sect. The mother, along with Maria 3.5 years earlier, when Maria was just 1.5 years, they had been lured to this very house where her mother was murdered right in front of Maria. And then after her mother was killed, they cooked her mother and fed pieces of the mother to Maria. And ever since, they had just kept Maria and treated her like she was a member of the family, basically turning her into an unwitting cannibal. The existence of the cult and their hideous murders were ultimately discovered after they used one of the credit cards of their victims sometime in the spring of 2012. That's when all the cops rushed into the backyard and confronted Maria. George, Isabel, and Bruna, Maria's fake family, were convicted of 3 murders, including the murder of Maria's real mother, and they are currently serving what amounts to life sentences in Brazil. Police believe the actual number of women that they murdered is as many as 8. As for Maria, according to recent news articles, she was reunited with distant family. Maria is not her real name. That is a pseudonym to protect her identity. On the afternoon of July 18, 1997, a man was driving down a road surrounded on both sides by trees in a rural part of Wisconsin called Douglas County. There were no other cars on the road, and so this guy was driving pretty fast. And as he rounded this bend in the road, something out the passenger side window on the side of the road in the grass caught his eye.
He couldn't tell what it was, but it was a pretty big object, and after he drove right past it, he just couldn't stop thinking about it. Like, whatever it was, it just seemed out of place. And so for whatever reason, this man felt compelled to actually stop and go see what it was. And so he slowed down and parked on the shoulder, he got out, and began walking along the road back in the direction of this object. And as he got closer, he began to see this object again in the shoulder of the road, and it was sort of obscured by grass and other things, so he couldn't see what it was. But as he got closer, he saw the object was pretty big, and it was all white. And as he took a few more steps and got within maybe 20 or 30 feet, he finally got a better look at this object, and he just froze. Because the object was a man wearing all white, a white suit, a white belt, white shoes, all white, and he was laying on the side of the road, just totally motionless. And for a second, the driver thought, maybe this guy is sleeping, but after taking only a few more steps and getting a totally unobstructed view at this guy, he saw there was a gaping hole in this man's chest. He was obviously dead. And so the driver turned around, ran back to his car, sped to the nearest house, and called 911. The next morning, a Douglas County detective named Stephen Long was sitting at his desk looking at the photos of the dead man in white. This murder case was less than 24 hours old, but already this was one of the weirder cases that this detective had ever been assigned to. The victim had pretty much immediately been identified because he was carrying on his person his wallet, and in his wallet was his driver's license, and so they knew who he was. But the man in white's identity actually made the whole case more confusing, not less. The dead man was a 45-year-old millionaire named Mark Foster. Mark lived 3 hours away in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and had no discernible ties to Douglas County. And so the detective was thinking, what is this rich guy doing here, dressed head to toe, all in white, getting murdered on the side of some local random back road? But things only got more confusing from there. After the medical examiner did Mark's autopsy, he told Detective Long that he had discovered a note inside of Mark's shoe. And the note just said, "Jack Frazier isn't here, but it's Jimmy Bailey, or a lookalike? I hope I'm okay." Now, nobody, including Detective Long, had any idea what this note meant. It was far too cryptic. But when they ran Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey's names through their database, the police discovered that both of those men, one, existed, and two, they lived in Minnesota, same as Mark Foster. And so naturally, Detective Long began to suspect that maybe those two men were connected in some way to Mark Foster. Maybe they were involved in his murder, or maybe they were actually his killer or killers. He didn't know, but it was his best lead. So Detective Long decided he would just have to go to Minneapolis to try to find out more. A few hours later, Detective Long parked his car at the Minneapolis police station. He got out and walked inside the building. Waiting for him inside was the local detective who Mark had already spoken to. And so after meeting this detective, the two of them went into an interview room where Mark Foster's wife was waiting for them. And right away, Detective Long noticed that she was very pregnant and at least 15 or 20 years younger than Mark. But despite that, she seemed very composed. It would turn out she had already been told about her husband's death, and she was basically resigned to the fact that she was here to try to answer questions to figure out what happened. And so the detective sat down and they began to interview her. And then when they brought up the note that was found in Mark's shoe, specifically when they said the two names that were on that note, Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey, when they said that, it triggered something in Mark Foster's wife. She immediately began to cry. And then in between sobs, she would tell the detectives that she knew who those two men were. She told them that she had previously had relationships with both of them before marrying Mark. And she said after she married Mark, Jack and Jimmy became very jealous. They didn't like the idea that she had chosen Mark over them. And so she had always felt like those two, Jack and Jimmy, sort of had it out for Mark as a result of this romantic rivalry. After the interview with Mark's wife ended, Detective Long began to think that, despite this case appearing on the surface to be very odd and confusing, that perhaps in reality, it was quite simple. Maybe Jimmy and Jack were so jealous of Mark that they killed Mark. Based on what Mark's wife had just told them in the interview about them being romantic rivals of Mark, and also the fact that that note was in Mark's shoe and named those two men, it certainly seemed very possible. But over the next couple of days that Detective Long began digging into this theory, that theory fell apart. because it would turn out Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey had absolutely airtight alibis. They simply couldn't have been the killers. Now, Detective Long was obviously frustrated. He felt like he really had it here, but he was not deterred. He decided his next move would be to try to better understand his victim. To this point, he had already interviewed a lot of Mark's friends and family, but something he had not done yet was simply go to Mark's house and have a look around. So Detective Long got a search warrant, and on July 29th, roughly a week after Mark was killed, Detective Long, along with another detective, pulled up in front of Mark Foster's large 2-story home in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Now, from the outside, the home looked totally ordinary relative to its neighbors. But once they got inside the house, it was anything but. The detectives made their way up to the front door and knocked, and a few seconds later, Mark Foster's wife opened up the door and let them inside. And right away, Detective Long is looking around, and he's seeing all over the walls on the first floor of the house are these graphic pictures and paintings of naked people. And then in addition to that, on some of the coffee tables and various surfaces on the first floor, right when you walk in, are all these pornographic magazines and books everywhere. And Mark's wife didn't acknowledge any of it. She acted like it was completely normal to have all this stuff right in the front part of your house. And so the two detectives are looking at each other as, Mark's wife is leading them on this tour through the first floor. And at some point, Detective Long just said, "Hey, Mrs. Foster, why don't you have a seat on the couch and you just let us take a look around your house on our own?" And so she said, okay. She sat down on the couch, and then the two detectives, they left the living room, went back to the front of the house, and made their way upstairs. And once they got upstairs, they found the master suite, and there was all this bondage gear inside. There were leather straps attached to the bedposts, there was whips and handcuffs, there was also additional pornographic material in there. But, considering what the detectives had seen downstairs, this sort of felt on par for this house. And so after searching the other bedrooms and other rooms on the second floor and finding more pornographic material basically everywhere, the detectives found their way back to the hallway in the second floor, and they noticed there was a rope hanging down from the ceiling, and it was attached to the pull door that led to the attic. And so the two detectives, they walked over, they pulled the rope down, it revealed this fold-out set of stairs that came down from the attic, and once those were in place, the two detectives began climbing up. And once they got up there, they discovered that this attic was not a storage space like many attics are in American homes. Instead, this attic was a fully functional room that sort of resembled like a satanic dungeon of sorts. All the walls were totally jet black, and there were all these burned out candles all over the place and tarot cards littering the floor. And on the back of the attic, basically all the way on the other side, there was what appeared to be an altar that sort of overlooked the entire room. And on the altar were more candles, and there was a voodoo doll. It's totally creepy, and the two detectives are looking at each other like, what's going on here? And so the detectives, they climbed all the way into the attic, and then slowly began walking across towards the altar. And when they got close enough to actually see the altar up close, they just froze. Because sitting on the altar, in addition to the candles and the voodoo doll, were two business cards. Their own business cards. Detective Long and his partner immediately went downstairs and confronted Mark's wife about the attic. Like, what's going on up there? Why are our business cards on your altar? But Mark's wife, the second that attic was mentioned, went silent. She refused to speak about anything to do with the attic. And so after a minute, realizing this conversation was going nowhere, Detective Long and his partner called for backup. And as they waited for backup, the two of them stepped away from Mark's wife and began speculating like, is this a cult? Was Mark a part of a cult that ran it out of his attic? What's going on here? And are we being targeted by the cult? Is that why our names are on the altar? A few minutes later, backup arrived, and they would do a much more extensive search of the property. But other than finding more pornographic materials and, bondage gear, there really wasn't anything else substantive that connected Mark or his wife to what happened to Mark, or what Mark was even doing in this house. Was he in a cult? They didn't know. And so ultimately, Detective Long and his partner told Mark's wife, who still is being quiet at this point, that she should not leave town because they were going to follow up with her soon. Now, in fairness, Detective Long couldn't tell if Mark's wife was being silent and not talking about what was going on in her house because, she was complicit in some way in what happened to Mark, or if she was maybe being threatened by somebody and she was afraid to talk. They didn't know. But either way, after leaving the property after the search was over, Detective Long and his partner felt like their next move was to try to learn more about cults
they needed a cult expert. And it just so happened there was an occult bookstore very close to Mark's house. And so they decided they would start there. And right away, their decision to go to that bookstore paid dividends, but not how the detectives expected. It would turn out the owner of that bookstore was indeed a cult expert. But much more importantly, and relevant to this case, was that the owner happened to personally know Mark Foster. And he told the detectives that Mark came to his bookstore all the time, and also the owner said he knew a bunch of Mark's friends. And so by the time the detectives left the bookstore, they had learned a little bit about cults, but more importantly, they left with a list of names the owner had given them of known associates of Mark Foster who maybe were involved in whatever was going on in Mark's house, and so maybe they had information about what happened to Mark. The detectives were able to track down everybody on this list very quickly, and they were all young people in their 20s. And in each of the interviews they conducted, each of these young people were very open about being in what they called a religious group that they said Mark was a part of as well. Now, the detectives theorized that this religious group was very likely a cult, like they believed, but they didn't call it a cult, they called it a group. But the detectives didn't let up. They kept pressing these people until eventually a new name surfaced, Greg Freisner. Now, none of these people said Greg was in charge of the cult. Instead, they just sort of said, well, talk to Greg if you want more information about our group. The detectives naturally began to wonder if this Greg person was the cult leader, or maybe he was Mark's killer, or maybe he was both. But regardless, it seemed pretty apparent that they needed to talk to Greg because he might have more information about what happened to Mark. It took a few days, but the detectives were able to track Greg down and they brought him in for an interview. And boy, oh boy, did Greg have a story to tell. Based on what Greg told the detectives, here is what happened to Mark on the day that he died, on July 18th, 1997. On that day, Greg Freisner met Mark Foster at Mark's home. And when Mark came outside, he was dressed head to toe in white, something he would do for special ceremonies. And so Mark, he came down the steps, didn't say a word to Greg. They went to Greg's car. Greg hopped in the driver's seat, and Mark climbed into the back seat. And before long, they took off and began driving northeast. And for hours, these two just drove in total silence. Mark just stared out the window, and Greg focused on driving. The only thing that happened during this multi-hour-long drive was at some point Mark pulled out a piece of paper from his coat pocket, and he wrote something on it, and then after staring at it, he kind of smiled and tucked it into his shoe. And then a little bit later, Greg pulled over on the side of the road in Douglas County, Wisconsin, on this random backcountry road. And as soon as they pulled over, again without saying anything, Greg and Mark got out of the car, and they went around to the back of the car where the trunk was. And the two men are kind of stretching, it's been a long drive, taking in the scenery. And then before long, Greg pops open the trunk. And in the trunk is a rifle. Neither man have any strong reaction to this. Greg just reaches down, pulls the rifle out, and Mark, calm as can be, just begins walking over to the side of the road, to the shoulder. And then once he got to the shoulder, Greg came over and stood right in front of him and just looked intently into Mark's eyes, looking for the signal. And at some point, after Mark kind of composed himself, he nodded at Greg. At which point Greg raised that rifle, placed the barrel directly on Mark's chest, and fired. Mark crumpled to the ground, and he laid there for a second just moaning horribly, and Greg just stood over him watching until finally Mark went silent and died, at which point Greg casually went back to his car, got inside, and drove home. The only time he stopped was to throw his rifle into a nearby river. But once Greg got home, he was overjoyed because he knew the sacred ritual he had just carried out with Mark had been a total success. It had gone exactly to plan. It would turn out Mark Foster was absolutely a member of that religious group, the cult, if you will. Except he was not just a member. He was the cult's leader. And Mark is the one who orchestrated his own death. However, Mark did not view his death as him actually dying. Quite the opposite.
We celebrate life as we celebrate death. Death is nothing to be afraid of. Death is a great crossroads, a change in attitude, a change in longitude, a change in the way that we perceive our spirit. When we reach that portal, they'll ring some golden bells.
He believed that what he and Greg, his most devout follower, were going to do, this sacred ritual, was after Greg fires the shot into his chest and ends this body's life, that his soul, his consciousness, and his power will be transferred into Greg. Basically, his soul will go into Greg. And Mark believed once this transfer happened, that basically he would be immortal, that his soul would never die. It would stay in Greg and then maybe at some point get transferred to somebody else, but basically he would be here forever. The bizarre note that was found in Mark's shoe, the note that he wrote and stuffed in there, that note was designed to throw police off the trail. He knew that he was having Greg murder him, again for this ritual, but he wanted to make sure Greg didn't get caught. And so he wrote on the note very specifically Jack Frazier and Jimmy Bailey. Those two people he hated. He hated that they had been in past relationships with his wife, and they hated him, and so he figured if he was going to create a scapegoat for his murder, who better than his romantic rivals? They had nothing to do with it. He just named them in that cryptic note to get them in trouble. As for all the pornography and bondage gear that was found inside of Mark's home, well, that all played a role in Mark's cult as well. He was a firm believer that the more sex he had with his followers, often multiple followers at the same time, the more powerful he would become. As for the detective's business cards found on the altar up in the attic, those were very likely placed there by followers of Mark, so members of the cult, in an effort to potentially, thwart their efforts to solve the case. They might have believed that by placing those on there and performing various rituals, that somehow would prevent them from solving the case. We don't know for sure. That's the theory around why they were there, but obviously that didn't work. Greg Freisner would ultimately be found guilty for playing a role in Mark's death. He obviously was the trigger man, and so he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As for Mark's wife, although she definitely knew about the cult and may have been a participant, there was never any evidence that actually connected her to Mark's murder, and so she was never charged with any crime.
Is called My Brother's Keeper.
Just after midnight on March 9th, 1947, a man slipped out the front door of his 4-story brownstone mansion on New York City's iconic Fifth Avenue. The man was named Langley Collier. He was 61 years old, and he was a trained engineer. He was a very famous concert pianist, and he was very wealthy. But he didn't dress like he was wealthy. This night, Langley was going for an 8-mile walk to the south to Brooklyn, New York, where he was going to pick up a very specific thing that he needed for his older brother Homer, who was currently laid up in bed on the second floor of the mansion. It was a freezing cold night, and so as Langley walked along the road, he flipped up his collar of his very shabby wool coat that was held together by safety pins. Nowadays, Langley felt like the only time he was safe going outside was at night, because at nighttime he could kind of hide from the prying eyes of his neighbors or police officers or really anyone. It was the one time he could basically be invisible. And so Langley scurried his way down the dimly lit sidewalk, looking left and right constantly to make sure he wasn't being followed, and then finally at 2 a.m. he arrived at his destination in Brooklyn, a very particular set of dumpsters. And right away, Langley got to work. He went in that dumpster and he got the things he was looking for and then put them in his bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then began the long, slow walk back home. Several weeks later, on March 21st, the phone rang inside the police station near where the Collier brothers lived. And so a sergeant picked up the phone, and on the other line was a guy who called himself Charles Smith, and in a very gruff voice, he told the sergeant that there was a dead body in the Collier brothers' mansion. Now, while of course this was a huge tip, the sergeant was skeptical because the police were aware of the fact that there were lots of rumors floating around about the Collier brothers. They were very eccentric. I mean, Langley's going out at night with a bag over his shoulder and going to look at dumpsters in Brooklyn. I mean, they were also kind of reclusive, and the windows outside of their mansion were boarded up with wood and metal. And so people were kind of on edge about the Collier brothers, and periodically, when they heard rumors about them, they would call the police and report it.
And so the police were used to getting these rumor calls, going and checking it out, only to discover that they were not true. And so this sergeant said to Charles Smith, well, how do you know there's a dead body inside the mansion? But the caller simply didn't answer and hung up. And so because the sergeant did not necessarily believe this was a credible tip, instead of sending an entire investigative team to the mansion to check out this dead body, he asked a single police officer to, when he had time, make his way over and basically do a wellness check on the Collier brothers. And so later that day, this one lone police officer showed up to the Collier brothers' mansion. He got out of his cruiser and he just stopped and looked at the brownstone mansion. Even though it was every bit a mansion, it was not in good condition. All the windows were boarded up with wood and metal, and the glass behind them was all shattered. There was newspapers coming out of the broken windows like they had been jammed up against the inside of the windows. There was all this furniture and wooden crates and just junk piled up outside the front of the property. I mean, the place looked kind of dilapidated, and he was shocked that anybody lived in here to begin with. But the Collier family were not normal people. Langley and Homer's dad was a doctor, and he would take home pieces of real people, like parts and organs and that kind of thing, and he would put them in glass jars and put them on display all over the house. Their dad also always canoed to work, which meant walking out of the mansion with a canoe on his shoulder, walking to East River, canoeing his way in his fancy doctor clothes all the way until he got off, and then carrying the canoe to his office building. As for Langley and Homer's mother, she was the first cousin of their dad, and she also kicked their dad out of the house when he tried to convert their entire house into a sanatorium, which is kind of like a cross between a hospital and a resort for people who are recovering from tuberculosis. And so the brothers had grown up in this very odd family, and while they were totally brilliant, they were also very eccentric. Homer, the older brother, was a literal genius who was accepted to study law at the highly prestigious Ivy League University, Columbia, at the age of 14. Langley, who was 5 years younger than Homer, also graduated from Columbia, where he got 2 degrees, one in engineering and one in chemistry. But Langley wasn't just an accomplished scientist, he was also this incredible musician. In fact, he was such a talented pianist that he actually performed shows at New York's legendary Carnegie Hall. But despite their incredible achievements and their huge wealth, Homer and Langley never got married. And over time, after the death of their parents, Homer and Langley became more and more reclusive inside of this mansion. And then in 1933, so 14 years before this lone police officer had arrived at the Collier brothers' mansion to investigate a dead body, Homer Collier had had a stroke and went completely blind. He was only 55 at the time, and really he was at the height of his career, but he was forced to quit his law practice. As for Langley, even though he was very successfully selling pianos and playing these incredible shows at Carnegie Hall, he too had to give up what he was doing and stay home and take care of his brother. And once this happened, the 2 brothers basically stayed in the mansion all the time. They basically never left. And they also stopped paying any of their bills, so their water, their phone, their electricity all got cut off, but instead of the brothers paying the bills to get the power back, Langley just went out and bought a Model T car, and he pulled the engine out of the car and built his own generator. And then when they stopped paying their mortgage, eventually the police came to the mansion to evict them, and when Langley came to the door to speak to the officer, he just wrote a check for the entire amount of the mansion, basically paying for it on the spot. He handed the check to the police officer and then told the officer to leave them alone. And so fast forward back to March 21st, 1947, and this lone police officer, after staring up at this dilapidated mansion, finally walked forward and climbed over all the furniture and junk that was all out front, and he literally climbed his way up the front steps to the front door, where he began pounding on it. But after a while, no one came to the door, and the officer couldn't hear anything inside.
Now, because this officer was here to investigate a dead body, no matter how uncredible the claim, the officer knew he really needed to get inside and have a look around. And so he decided he would try to break in the front door. And so after knocking a few more times just to make sure really no one was there, the officer called out and said, "I'm coming in," and then began pounding with his shoulder against the door. And pretty quickly, the door gave way. But it only opened a few inches. And so the officer tried to fit through it, but he was too big, he couldn't fit. But he was able to look into the crack, and he saw there was this huge man-made wall that was basically positioned right inside of the mansion, blocking the front door from opening more than a couple of inches. And so as the officer was thinking about why there would be this wall here, he began to smell this terrible smell coming out of the mansion. And at that point, the officer thought, okay, there could be a dead body in here. I don't know what's going on. And so he called for backup. When backup arrived, the group of officers attempted to smash the front door in together. All 7 of them are ramming against this door, but they could not break down the man-made wall inside. And so ultimately, the police got a ladder and they lined it up on the side of the property, and one of the officers was able to climb up to the second floor, break a window, and climb in that way. And once the police all made their way into the second floor of this mansion, they realized very quickly that the tip Charles Smith had given had been correct. There was a dead body inside of this mansion. It was Homer Collier, the older brother. He was seated in a chair in this alcove on the second floor. He only had on this ragged bathrobe, and he was kind of slouched forward with his head resting on his knee with all these orange peels all around him. The coroner would ultimately determine that Homer likely had been dead for about 10 hours. As for Langley Collier, despite looking around the mansion for him, they couldn't find him. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. And so pretty quickly, the police became suspicious of Langley because they couldn't find him, and they began to think, maybe he had something to do with his brother's death, and that's why he's not here now. In fact, maybe it was Langley who called in the tip as Charles Smith out on the road somewhere after he'd run away. So the police posted an officer at the Collier brothers' mansion. Basically, his job was to stay there in case Langley came back at any time, he could be detained. And then also the police put out a 9-state alarm. Basically all the states around New York were told to keep an eye out for Langley because he was wanted for questioning in connection to his brother's death. And so as police agencies all across the East Coast searched for Langley, largely in vain, detectives in New York continued to search the Collier brothers' mansion to find clues that might shed some light about where Langley went and what role he might have played in Homer's death. And on April 8th, 1947, so 18 days after Homer was first discovered, the police would finally find that big clue that would break the case wide open. Back on March 21st, when that lone police officer first responded to the Collier brothers' house because of this call about the dead body, and then the officer broke the door in and discovered that man-made wall right behind the door, well, that man-made wall was not constructed out of normal building materials like brick or wood or anything else you might expect a wall to be built out of. Instead, it was built out of things like chairs and beds and a sewing machine and all sorts of just junk. It was trash. And this trash wall started right in front of the inside of the front door, and it extended back towards the interior living space of that floor. Except there really wasn't any living space at all anywhere inside of this mansion. Not the second floor, first, third, fourth, nowhere. Because every surface inside of this mansion was covered wall to wall, floor to ceiling in trash. Things like 14 broken pianos, an x-ray machine, there was a horse's jawbone, there were 25,000 books, and of course they had all of their father's glass jars that contained all of these human body parts. And over the years, the Collier brothers had apparently begun to think that their neighbors and random passerbys out on the street would someday break into their mansion and steal these treasures from their home. For reference, the Collier brothers did have real treasure in their house. They had tons of cash, they had jewelry, they had real valuables. But to them, that wasn't the real treasure. The real treasure were the things they pulled out of the dumpsters all around the city. And so that was the stuff they were worried about getting stolen from random people outside. And so they had begun fortifying the inside of this mansion to protect themselves when inevitably these people began breaking in. And so basically the inside of their mansion had not just been turned into a big trash pile, but instead they had created all these sophisticated tunnels through all the trash that was everywhere. And lining these tunnels and all these special alleyways they had built were real booby traps. And it was when the police were inspecting one of these tunnels with booby traps in it that they discovered the big clue that broke the case wide open.
Our next story is called The Dream. On March 7th, 1975, 21-year-old Mark Hansen, along with two of his friends from college, Ben Fish and John Chidester, arrived at a parking lot on the eastern side of the Appalachian Trail. All three of the young men were in incredible physical shape and were excited to spend their spring break challenging themselves on some of the trail's most rigorous hikes. The day before they were supposed to go, they almost canceled the trip because there was this terrible weather system that was coming over the trail, and they were thinking, it's going to be dangerous, it's not such a good idea. And then they started talking some more, and they were like, well, we're already going to, challenge ourselves. It would be even more challenging to hike these really difficult trails with the inclusion of bad weather. So this is another way to, test our abilities. And so they kind of got pumped up at the idea of hiking the Appalachian Trail in terrible weather. So the guys arrive in the parking lot, the windshield wipers are furiously working to keep the pouring rain off. They hop out and they're getting soaked by the rain. They put on their ponchos, they grab their heavy packs, and they make their way over to the trail. Their plan was to move west along the trail until they hit the Tri-Corner Shelter, where they would spend their first night. The Tri-Corner Shelter is one of the many shelters along the Appalachian Trail. They are open to the public. There's no heating or electricity, but it provides shelter from the storm. You can go in there and, get in a sleeping bag and you'll be fine. But to get to the Tri-Corner Shelter, they would need to hike 16 miles, almost completely uphill, walking right into the wind, and it's raining on them, and it's supposed to snow later on, so it's just a treacherous first day. But they take off, they start walking up this trail, and after a couple of miles, John says, you know what, guys? This is awful. I think we should probably turn around. I think we've underestimated how bad this is going to be. Let's go back to the car, and we'll do this another time. But Mark and Ben were like, oh no, we are committed. We are doing this. We are not turning around. And John's like, you know what? Suit yourself. I'm not going to do that. And he turned around and he left and he went back to the car and he would pick them up when they were done. After John turned around, Mark and Ben, they felt good. They felt tough. They're going to stick this hike out. And so they take off again and Ben's in the lead. And Ben seems to be handling the poor weather and difficult hike and heavy pack a lot better than Mark is. In fact, over the next several hours, Mark would drift farther and farther back and Ben would need to wait for him and Mark would be hunched over, really just struggling with this hike. And then at some point, Mark yells to him and says, I gotta take my pack off. I can't carry this much weight up this hill until we get to the shelter. I'm not gonna make it to the shelter. Then Ben would say to him, if we don't get to the shelter for some reason, you're gonna be stranded out here in this storm without any warm clothes, without your sleeping bag, without your tent, without your food, without your water. It's way too dangerous. You have to keep your pack on. And so finally Mark is convinced and he's like, oh, all right, puts his pack back on and they continue moving. About an hour later at 7 p.m., they had reached the section of the trail where they knew they were getting close-ish to the Tri-Corner Shelter. They were certainly well beyond the halfway point. But it was dark out, the temperature had dropped significantly. At this point, Ben is basically Mark's cheerleader, kind of egging him on to keep moving, and Mark's kind of staggering along this trail, and Ben and Mark are just hoping that shelter just appears at some point here because they don't know how much farther they can go. Another hour and a half goes by. They still haven't made it to the shelter. Mark is groaning. He can barely move. It's pitch black. The rain has now completely shifted over to snow, and it is just dumping snow on them. And Ben is concerned that, somehow did we take a wrong turn, even though they were on a really well-marked trail, and he knew they hadn't. He figured they must be so close at this point. And it was around this time that Mark yells out to Ben, I'm done. I can't go any farther. and he sits down right in the middle of the trail. He's sitting down with his pack, and he's just laying there, and Ben is like, come on, we're so close, you can't sit down now. And Mark's like, I'm not moving. I can't do any more. I'm gonna sleep right here. Ben knows this is a bad idea. I mean, they did have warm clothes and sleeping bags, and they probably would be just fine sleeping out in the middle of the trail, but it just seemed so unnecessarily risky when there's probably a shelter, maybe a couple 100 meters away, and he would turn out to be right. And so he decides he's gonna walk ahead on the trail, and he's gonna see if the shelter's there, but he only went about 100 meters. He was within maybe 100 meters of the actual shelter, but he never saw it. And so after going ahead and feeling like, man, I don't want to drag Mark any farther, if there's no shelter ahead, for all we know, we took a wrong turn. And so he turns back around and he goes back near Mark, not next to him, but close enough to him that he can see him. And he sits down on the trail too. He gets his sleeping bag out, he crawls inside, and he falls asleep. Today's story is called The Karankis Curse. It was a chilly morning on September 15th, 2007. A sheep farmer named Gregorio Yaruri sat on his porch, sipping a mug of coffee and looking at the distant mountain peaks that surrounded his hometown of Karankis, a small village in southern Peru. It was silent except for the sheep bleating in the pasture. Then Gregorio heard a low sound, like a hum. At first, the noise was faint, and it sounded like it was coming from miles away. Then the hum grew louder, and the coffee in his mug started to vibrate. A moment later, pebbles on the ground surrounding his porch began to shake as the hum turned into a roar. Alarmed, Gregorio set down his mug and leaped down into the yard. He looked around, trying to figure out if the noise was human-made or maybe an earthquake. He covered his ears as the hum roared to a deafening scream. Then he spotted something small and orange streaking through the sky. An instant later, a sonic boom whipped across the valley, shattering a window in Gregorio's house. He was thrown onto his back and he rolled a few times before steadying himself in the dirt. Noises began to erupt all across the plain. Gregorio could hear dogs howling and shouts coming from some of the neighboring farms. Gregorio was bracing himself for something else to happen, but the sky above him was bright blue again. So he stood up, feeling totally shell-shocked, as he brushed the dust from his pants. He scanned the horizon for some clue as to what had caused this explosion. In the distance, he could see a plume of thick black smoke rising 100 feet into the air. At first, Gregorio was filled with dread. Then, a sense of determination swelled up inside of him. He needed to know what had just fallen from the sky. He ran for the bicycle he kept leaning up against the side of his house. He brushed the glass shards from his broken window off the seat, and then he hopped on and he set his feet on the pedals and took off towards the tower of smoke. As Gregorio neared the site of impact, the smell of rotten eggs stung the inside of his nostrils. He pulled over just long enough to grab his bandana out of his back pocket and tie it around his face to block the smell. About 100 feet from the tower of smoke, he noticed red dust covering the ground. The closer he got, the thicker the blanket of dust seemed to be. When he finally reached the base of the smoke plume, he rubbed the dust with his feet. It appeared to be clay that had been kicked up by the crash. The smoke was so thick, he still couldn't tell what had impacted the ground. But whatever it was, it had created what appeared to be a huge crater in the ground. The column of smoke was emerging from a hole about 50 feet across. It really looked like someone had just detonated a bomb there. A few minutes later, the smoke started thinning out, and Gregorio could finally see into this crater. He walked up to the edge, and his eyes widened from a combination of fear and wonder. The crater was filled with a dark green liquid. The liquid had a consistency somewhere between maybe water and sludge, and it was bubbling as if it was simmering. Gregorio pinched his nose through the bandana. The egg smell coming off of this crater was so strong that he felt sick to his stomach. He walked around the perimeter of the crater, kicking at the shards of clay and jagged rock that littered the ground. It looked like someone had smashed a huge vase to pieces. Gregorio scanned the horizon. It seemed like he was the only person who'd come to investigate this plume of smoke. He figured the neighboring farmers must be worried that whatever crashed into the ground was a bad omen. A lot of his neighbors still believed in ancient spirits. But after a while, it struck Gregorio as kind of odd that not even an emergency vehicle had come out to survey the scene. Something had just shot out of the sky and smashed into the earth. It felt like that was the kind of thing police would want to know about. But Gregorio knew help would not be coming from his village. Only about 250 people lived in Caracas, so it didn't have its own police force. The authorities were located in the nearby town of Desaguadero, which was about 7 miles up the road. Gregorio wasn't sure if the folks in Desaguadero would be able to see the smoke plume from there. If they couldn't, he worried that the authorities might not even know this happened. Gregorio jumped back on his bicycle and pedaled to the house of a neighbor who owned a motorcycle that Gregorio knew he'd be able to borrow. It was going to be up to him to raise the alarm, and he had to get out there fast. About 20 minutes later, Gregorio parked his borrowed motorcycle in front of the police station in Desaguadero and then walked inside. He was greeted by a tired-looking receptionist with the phone pressed to her ear. It seemed like she'd been talking to people for hours. 3 deputies were talking loudly about an airstrike. It took a minute for Gregorio to realize what was going on. The police did know about this explosion. One of them had seen the orange streak in the sky, but they thought that Caracas had actually been struck by a missile. Gregorio waved down one of the officers and explained he had seen a crater filled with this green ooze that smelled terrible. The officer disappeared into a back room for a moment, and then he returned with the chief of police. They asked if Gregorio could lead them to the crash site. Gregorio agreed. Soon, he was back on his neighbor's motorcycle, leading police cars along the 7-mile road back to the Caracas countryside. As the crash site came into view, Gregorio could see people moving around the rim of the crater. As he drew even closer, he realized that dozens of villagers from Caracas had come to see what had caused the smoke. He guessed that when the black plume of smoke had dissipated, the neighbors figured it was now safe to come take a look. Gregorio pulled over his motorcycle about 20 yards from the crater and dismounted. The police cars fanned out around him. As policemen approached the perimeter of the crater, Gregorio noticed his neighbors picking up rock fragments as souvenirs and pointing at the green liquid at the bottom of the massive hole. Gregorio overheard a nearby couple speculate that maybe this was the result of a missile strike from Peru's neighbor and rival, Chile. One teenage boy was talking excitedly, telling his friends they were probably just attacked by a UFO. An old woman, who Gregorio assumed was the boy's grandmother, told him to be quiet. This was clearly a sign of bad things to come, a curse sent by the spirits. She sounded terrified. Gregorio did not find any of these theories very convincing. However, he wasn't ready to offer any of his own. But the strange explosion had him just as curious as his neighbors. He picked up a shard of deep red rock near his feet and slipped it into his coat pocket, just as another car pulled onto the scene. Gregorio recognized the mayor of Caracas, Maximiliano Trujillo. Mayor Trujillo stepped out of the back seat, squinting in the sunlight. The mayor walked toward the crater, looking stunned. He stopped right next to Gregorio and asked what happened. Gregorio just shrugged, still in disbelief. Straight ahead of them, a pile of black rocks were smoking at the edge of the crater. The mayor's eyes widened when he saw them, and he began walking toward the crater to get a better look. By late afternoon, hundreds of people had gathered at the crash site. Gregorio stood near the front of the crowd, hoping that if he stuck around long enough, the police might announce what had caused this explosion. As the sun started to set, the smell of rotten eggs returned. It was faint, but pungent. Gregorio's eyes began to water. He pulled his bandana back up over his face, but that didn't work anymore. The smell was giving him a headache. A few minutes later, a short woman standing near Gregorio leaned over and began vomiting, and she wasn't the only one. People all around the crater were starting to get sick. Between the rotten smell coming off the green sludge and now the vomit, the air around the crater was now so thick that Gregorio thought he might faint. He fought his way through the crowd back to his motorcycle and sped off towards home, sucking in the fresh air as he went. When he walked through his front door, his phone was ringing. It was his son, who had moved about 6 hours away for a job after he had graduated school. As Gregorio told him about the afternoon's excitement, he took the rock out of his pocket and he laid it on the kitchen table. He began to describe its deep red color, but his son cut him off. He begged Gregorio not to touch it. If Carancas was attacked by a missile, then this red rock could very likely be radioactive. Gregorio remembered the people getting sick at the crater. He felt a surge of anxiety, and he covered the rock with a dish towel. If his son was right, half the town was now vulnerable, and Gregorio spent more time at the crater than anyone else. Panicked, he hung up on his son and ran outside to hose himself off. He didn't know how much it would help, but he had to do something. He spent the rest of the evening feeling totally anxious, until finally he managed to fall asleep. The next morning, Gregorio woke up with the sun as usual. He still felt a bit queasy, but no worse than the night before. He breathed a big sigh of relief, because he figured that radiation poisoning would have made him feel a lot sicker by now, and so probably he was in the clear. As the sunrise turned the sky a vivid pink, Gregorio walked out of his house towards the sheep pen. He grabbed tufts of hay and dried grass and scattered them on the ground, and the sheep came running over to graze. Gregorio watched until one of the sheep picked its head up and ambled away. Then he noticed something unusual. There were dark splotches on the hay right where the sheep's head had been. It took Gregorio a moment to realize what he was looking at. He walked over and grabbed the sheep that had ambled off, and he lifted its head up, and blood was trickling out of its nose. Then he looked at the ground. Another splotch of blood stained the hay beneath his feet. As he walked the length of the pen, he found drops of blood spattered all over the ground. Gregorio rushed inside and called his vet, expecting to leave a voicemail since it was still early, but to his surprise, the vet actually picked up. He sounded wide awake, like he'd already been up for hours. He said that he'd been getting calls all morning. Livestock across Carancas were getting sick. The vet promised to make Gregorio's farm his next stop. Gregorio thanked him and hung up. He had no idea what kind of sickness had emerged from that crater, but it seemed like it could be deadly. A few days after the crash, Mayor Trujillo walked between rooms at a health clinic. Every exam table had been turned into a makeshift hospital bed. More than 200 people who visited the crash site had flooded the hospital in Desaguadero. They were all sick with migraine headaches, and they were vomiting. The hospital got so overwhelmed with patients, they diverted people to smaller health clinics throughout the city, which were now acting as satellite operations. Mayor Trujillo had called the Red Cross to help administer care in these satellite clinics, but now even the clinics were completely full. The smell inside the packed clinic was terrible. People were retching and crying. To the mayor, it felt like he was walking through a war zone. Thankfully, he'd received confirmation that morning from the authorities in Lima, the capital of Peru, that Carancas had not been attacked by a missile. In fact, scientists said that the crater had been caused by a meteorite. Mayor Trujillo was relieved that they were not under attack, but a mystery remained. Nobody knew why people were now getting sick. Meteorites had never been known to have that kind of effect. Specialists were flying out from Lima to investigate further. Mayor Trujillo moved through the crowd of patients in the waiting room, trying his best to reassure them. He stopped by a Red Cross doctor who was tending to a small elderly woman on a folding chair. The mayor greeted the old woman and then thanked the doctor for traveling all this way to Desaguadero. The doctor stood upright, looking tired but hopeful. He explained that all the patients' blood work was coming back normal. He didn't know why they were sick, but judging from their symptoms, he said everyone should make a full recovery in a few days. Trujillo smiled with relief, but the old woman hissed and called the doctor a liar. Many of the patients around her nodded in agreement, eyeing the doctor like he was in on some big conspiracy. He heard them muttering about evil spirits causing this disaster. Trujillo knew that many villagers believed the meteorite was a curse from the ancient spirits, and because of that, many had refused to listen to the Red Cross doctors and aid workers. To Trujillo, this was the problem with people of the Carancas region. Outsiders never came to the area, so many of the villagers didn't trust them. Trujillo knew that Carancas was not cursed. He just needed to find a way to get his people to listen. Then an idea struck. Maybe he could get them to believe the science with the help of someone who could appease the spirits. Trujillo left the health clinic, climbed into his car, and drove the 7 miles to Carancas. The small village, nestled in the shadows of snow-capped mountains, was eerily quiet and deserted. As the mayor slowly drove through the narrow and winding streets, he could see people peering out their windows. Normally, they'd come outside to wave hello, but now it seemed like they were terrified of leaving their homes. A few minutes later, Trujillo pulled up to a small adobe house with a thatched roof. It belonged to the local shaman, a man the mayor had long respected for his wisdom. Everybody in town trusted the shaman, and Trujillo hoped he could bring some calm to the community. Trujillo stepped out of his car, and he was pleased to see that the shaman came out of his house to greet him. Trujillo explained the situation to the shaman, and the shaman nodded thoughtfully, and he agreed that the meteorite was not a curse, although it had disrupted balance in the land. And so he said he was happy to do his part to restore the natural order of things. Trujillo smiled and shook the shaman's hand. He promised he'd be in touch soon, and then Mayor Trujillo headed back to his car. With the shaman's help, he was sure he could get the townspeople to listen to him and restore order in the town. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Montreal, Canada, a professor named Peter Schultz was standing in line at a coffee shop scrolling through the news app on his phone. He taught Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at Brown University in Rhode Island, but he was in Montreal for a conference on craters made by meteorites and other space objects. He was fascinated by the articles about the meteorite strike in southern Peru, and not just because he found meteorites in general interesting. This one stuck out because it made no sense. The reports said that Carancas was struck by a chondrite meteorite, the most common type of meteorite, but also the most fragile. A chondrite meteorite is a type of rock that comes from asteroids. They're made up of small grains of minerals that have not been melted or changed much since they formed billions of years ago. Chondrites are so porous that they crack and burn up in Earth's atmosphere before they can hit the ground. To Peter, it seemed impossible that one of these chondrite meteorites could hit the Earth with enough force to create this massive crater. Stranger still, he had read that more than 200 people who visited the crash site had ended up in the hospital. Meteorites should not be making people sick. Peter thought there had to be more to the story than met the eye. Peter turned his phone to silent and spent the rest of the afternoon in back-to-back lectures at his conference. He finally left around dusk. As he walked to dinner, he noticed his voicemail was full of inquiries from different reporters and news outlets, hoping for a comment from him on how a meteorite could cause such a widespread sickness. But Peter had to tell these reporters the truth. He did not have answers, but he wanted to get them, and the only way to do it was to head to Peru and see the crater for himself. A few days later, Mayor Trujillo stood in the very crowded community center in Desaguadero. He had needed a huge space to hold this town hall meeting, and Carancas didn't really have a building that could accommodate this size crowd. Even this community center was packed with almost every single person from Carancas in attendance. The mayor shivered, but not because he was cold. He knew that the government scientists had discovered something that would have a profound impact on everyone in this area, and not just for those who had gotten sick at the crater. As Trujillo stood there waiting, he spotted Gregorio Yaruri sitting in the back. He was grateful to him for his role in alerting the authorities, and was happy to see that Gregorio looked healthy. In fact, most of the locals who'd gotten sick were starting to feel better. But Trujillo knew if they didn't listen to the scientists, then things could get worse again. Trujillo had invited 2 guests to this meeting. One was the local shaman, and the other was a geologist named Luisa Macedo. She was one of the scientists flown in by the government. The mayor made his way to the front of the crowd and called for silence. He had to choose his words carefully to avoid panicking those who believed that Carancas was actually cursed. He cleared his throat and announced that, yes, something had fallen from the sky, but it had been a meteorite from outer space. Before anyone could argue with him, he called the shaman over to join him and asked if he could prepare a sacrifice. It needed to be something that would appease the spirits in case they were the ones who sent the meteorite crashing to Earth. The shaman nodded. He told the crowd that they had rightfully sensed that the meteorite had unbalanced the land, but he reassured them that the correct sacrifice would help appease any unhappy spirits. He promised he would sacrifice a llama fetus at the crater as soon as possible, which should be enough to restore harmony to the area. Several of the older women present smiled, but Mayor Trujillo was still tense. Now came the hard part, getting them to accept the scientists' findings without panicking. He introduced Luisa, the government geologist. The hall erupted in whispers. Trujillo told the villagers to calm down, that Luisa was from southern Peru just like they were. That's why he'd asked her to speak. Everyone seemed to accept this, since a regional scientist seemed a little more trustworthy. The crowd settled down a bit, and then Luisa smiled and she held up a large cardboard chart she'd made showing data on the local water table. Trujillo held his breath, worried she was making things more complicated. Instead, the crowd pushed in to get a better look at what she had. Luisa explained that she and her team weren't totally sure what was making so many people and livestock sick, but they had a strong theory. The day that she and her team had arrived in town, they'd gone to the crash site and collected samples from different parts of the area. They also tested the groundwater at the bottom of the crater. Mayor Trujillo saw Luisa hesitate for a moment and then continue. She said that her team found that the water contained dangerous levels of arsenic, a deadly poison. The crowd erupted in murmurs of alarm. As Trujillo looked around the room, he wasn't surprised by everyone's reaction. When he first heard Luisa's theory, he'd been stunned too, but he needed the crowd to listen. Their lives depended on what Luisa had to say. Trujillo raised his hands and called for order, and after a few seconds, the townspeople did quiet down, and he told them to continue to listen to Luisa. Luisa nodded and then explained that when the meteorite hit Caracas, the shockwave caused the groundwater to heat up and vaporize. This caused the air to fill with a fine mist of arsenic vapor. Everyone who had gone to see the crater got sick because they had inhaled that vapor. After hearing what she had to say, the crowd became agitated again and started shouting questions. Mayor Trujillo saw Gregorio in the back, trying to be heard, and so Trujillo demanded everyone be quiet, and he pointed at Gregorio and asked him to speak. Gregorio, the sheep farmer, stood up and politely asked Luisa if that meant their drinking water was contaminated too. Luisa stayed silent for a moment. Trujillo could tell she was carefully thinking about what to say next. Finally, she nodded and said that although they did need to do more testing, it was very likely. In fact, most likely, their water supply had been contaminated for years, making the people less healthy and more vulnerable to deadly diseases like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. And so until they knew for sure, Luisa advised the crowd to just drink bottled water. Gregorio was alarmed by what he heard, but he thanked her and sat down. Everyone else seemed totally stunned into silence by Luisa's explanation. First the meteor hit, making people sick. Now they learned their water was contaminated all along. Trujillo knew it was frightening, but at least they knew what they were dealing with. After answering more questions, Luisa wrapped up her remarks and walked off the stage. But as she headed toward him, Mayor Trujillo noticed that the scientist looked anxious. He pulled her aside and asked if everything was okay. Luisa shook her head and told him that something still didn't make sense. She was confident that the sickness had been caused by arsenic gas from the meteorite impact, but she had not actually proven that. No scientists had detected arsenic in the air around the crater. That was a theory. In fact, she didn't understand how the meteorite could have gotten hot enough to create this toxic arsenic vapor. Luisa explained that meteorites are usually freezing when they impact Earth, even though they may look like they're on fire. That's because space is extremely cold, with an average temperature of negative 454 degrees Fahrenheit. The friction caused by entering Earth's atmosphere would have heated it up a little bit, but not enough to boil water and turn it into a mist. Mayor Trujillo frowned. He now realized that even Luisa wasn't sure that her arsenic theory was right. And if she was wrong, then something else had made his people sick. Trujillo was troubled. But he had a more immediate challenge, making sure the local drinking water was safe. It was up to the scientists to figure out whether arsenic vapor or something else had caused the mass sickness. Until they figured it out, Trujillo knew he would not sleep well. A little over 2 months later, in December of 2007, Professor Peter Schultz arrived in Caracas to investigate the crash site. On a dry and sunny day, he drove through the winding roads of the rugged countryside until he reached the crater. Even though the rainy season had nearly filled it with water, he was struck by how massive it was. Peter had heard about Luisa Macedo's discovery of arsenic in the water. There was no debate that there was arsenic in the water itself, but so far, nobody had been able to explain how, or even if, arsenic got into the air. Until that was proven, there was still the possibility that some other chemical from the meteorite's impact had made everyone sick. If that was the case, the people of Caracas could still be in danger. Peter was determined to find the answer and make sure these people were safe. And over the next few weeks, he was able to slowly form a theory that connected all the dots. Usually, when chondrite meteorites shoot through the Earth's atmosphere, their fragile makeup causes them to shatter into hundreds of tiny pieces, which turn to ash long before they ever reach the Earth's surface. And that's what should have happened with this meteorite. Peter concluded that the Caracas meteorite survived its passage through the atmosphere because of its high speed and shallow entry angle. He believed that these factors, along with the heat from the Earth's atmosphere, caused the outer layers of the meteorite to melt and fuse back together. That made it dense enough to make it through the atmosphere, where it became superheated and unleashed the arsenic vapor once it hit the ground. All this meant that the people of Caracas were safe. It was the meteorite and not some other unidentified danger that heated up the arsenic-laced water and turned it into vapor. Thankfully, the damage caused by the meteorite's impact was not permanent. All the people who'd gotten sick, including Gregorio Yaruri, made a full recovery, and so did all the animals. Thanks to the research of Luisa Macedo and the other scientists, arsenic was detected in the drinking water, and nonprofit organizations have installed measures to make it safer. Even though the water is cleaner and the arsenic gas is long gone, the people of Caracas will always remember when, in a way, they were attacked by a UFO. On the afternoon of October 16, 1991, a 36-year-old man named Enrique Martinez bent down, pulled out his pocket knife, and he carefully cut through the stem of a mushroom that was growing right next to a mossy log. And then after freeing this mushroom, he put it inside of his wicker basket with the other mushrooms he had collected in the area. And then Enrique stood up and just took a minute to take in the unbelievable view of this lush green valley right below him. Enrique was out mushroom hunting along with his wife Anna and their two friends, Jorge and Sofia, who were dating. And where they were mushroom hunting was near this old abandoned town called La Musara, which is located up in the mountains of northeastern Spain. It had been Jorge's idea to come to this area and explore. Jorge had heard all these crazy stories about La Musara, about how it was haunted, and there was all this creepy folklore surrounding this town. As for Enrique, he didn't really care about the lore surrounding this town. Frankly, the town was not that interesting to him. What was interesting was the opportunity to come out here and collect mushrooms. That was something he really liked to do. Enrique and his wife Anna lived in this very busy port city in Spain called Tarragona, and so their lives day to day were very hectic. Enrique, he worked at a bar as a bartender, and so every night he was surrounded by hundreds of people coming in and out. And so having a chance to come out here and be in nature at peace and collect these mushrooms just sounded too good to turn up. Enrique stopped staring at the valley right in front of him, and he turned around and continued to scan the mountainside for a particular type of mushroom that grew in this area. It was called the bloody milk cap, which was known to be great for grilling. It paired well with meat. And so Enrique's plan was to go out on this mushroom hunting trip And when they got back, he wanted to cook a feast using these mushrooms for his wife and his friends. The group slowly made their way uphill until they finally saw the outskirts of the abandoned town, La Musara. La Musara was more than 900 years old, and now it was just a collection of crumbling ruins, some dating back to prehistoric times. La Musara had never been a big town. At its peak, it had about 300 residents. But the last of the remaining residents of this town had finally fled 40 years earlier, and so now it was a ghost town. The group made their way over to one of the buildings that was right on the outer perimeter of La Musara. It was basically just a foundation with 3 walls still standing, there was no roof, but the friends, they went over to this building, and from right next to it, they were able to look straight down the main drag of La Musara. It was basically just a dirt road that went straight out, and all along the road were other kind of ruined foundations of where buildings used to be. And fairly far down this road, maybe 200 feet away from where all the friends were standing, was the center of La Musara, which was marked by this big church with a huge steeple, and the church was actually in decent shape. It had not totally crumbled onto itself like the rest of the buildings around it. And then behind the church, somewhat visible from where the friends were standing, was this overgrown cemetery, and then kind of off to the side of the church was this pond that was also very overgrown, and it was full of croaking frogs. Enrique and his friends just stood there next to their dilapidated building, staring at La Musara in silence. Now, they knew this place was going to be very creepy. People had said it was haunted, and that was a big reason why Jorge wanted to come here. But now seeing it in person, really the creep factor was much higher than they expected. It really did look like a spooky place. And then adding to the spook factor was very clearly, as they were looking down this main road, the friends could see this mist kind of starting to envelop the town. Jorge had told the friends when he was doing his research about La Musara that the mist was really a trademark of this town. That at night, it basically got completely consumed in white mist. But now the friends are looking down this road, it's the middle of the day, and already the mist is starting to come in. Finally, Jorge broke the silence and said, "Hey, I want to show you guys something." And he grabbed his girlfriend Sophia's hand, and he began kind of jogging down the main road in the direction of the church. And so Enrique and Anna followed behind. And after only walking maybe 10 or 20 feet, Enrique happened to turn around and look back where they had just been standing next to this dilapidated building, and already he couldn't see that building because this fog had rolled in and totally obscured his view. Enrique couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, again, because he thought the fog was supposed to come in at night, and it's broad daylight, and here we are, totally covered in fog, but he shook it off thinking, what's the big deal? And so Enrique turned back around, and he and Anna hustled to catch up with Jorge and Sofia, who by this point had stopped a little farther down the road, off to the side, where there was this strange rectangular rock that was maybe 2 feet tall, just kind of jutting up out of the ground. And when Enrique and Anna made it to Jorge and Sofia, Jorge placed his hand on the top of this strange rock, and looking very satisfied with himself, he would tell his friends, "This is the Sis Stone, and people say it contains dark powers." The Sis Stone was actually one of the oldest things in all of La Musara. Back in the day, Muslim armies used to march through La Musara, which actually got its name from this. La Musara means the place to march. And so these armies, as they would pass through La Musara, making their way to the valley down below, they would always stop at the Sis Stone because they believed it had magical powers that could help them defeat their enemies in their upcoming battles. Now, the Muslim armies were long gone by this point, but the Sis Stone was still there, and people still said that it contained that kind of magical power, that there were dark forces at work inside of the stone, and so to touch it was very risky. In fact, some people said, if you touched the Sis Stone, you could be sucked into this parallel world full of all these demonic entities. And so as Jorge told the group about all this history surrounding the Sis Stone and how no one should touch it, remember, he's got his hands squarely on the Sis Stone the whole time. And so when he finishes telling this story, he looks at the others and said, "Come on, somebody else touch it." Jorge's girlfriend, Sofia, said, "Absolutely not. I'm not about to tempt evil spirits here." But Enrique's wife, Anna, said, "You know what? I'll touch it." And so Jorge smiled, he pulled his hand off the Sis Stone, and Anna, she walked forward, she took a deep breath, and then she placed her hand on the stone. And for a second, the whole group just held their breath, like something was going to reach out and grab Anna and pull her into the stone, but nothing happened, and a minute later, Anna had pulled her hand off and the whole group was laughing. But just a couple of seconds later, Enrique, who had been laughing along with the group, suddenly noticed that the frogs in the pond near the church, a little farther down the road from where they were suddenly so much louder. It was almost like when they touched the stone, it had maximized the volume of these frogs. And so Enrique, he turned his whole body and began staring down the road through the mist and fog at this pond, and he could kind of barely make it out. You know, he was trying to see if there was something obvious causing these frogs to kind of go crazy. But as he stared at this pond, which again, he could barely see, right behind it was the church. But there was lots of fog kind of blocking the church. And for a second, the fog kind of parted, and Enrique got a full shot of one of the windows of this abandoned church. And in the window was this dark figure just standing there staring at Enrique and his friends. And Enrique, he sees this thing in the window, and in a second it was gone. And then the fog rolled back in, covered up the window, and Enrique couldn't see anything anymore. And so Enrique just stood there in stunned silence, having no idea if what he just saw had really just happened or if it was in his imagination or something. But before he could even try to process what had just happened, he heard his name being called. And so he kind of snapped out of it and he turned back to the group, and it was Anna who was now jokingly saying, "Come on, Enrique, touch the stone too." Enrique quickly scanned Anna, Sophia, and Jorge's face, and they were all smiling and laughing still, and so clearly none of them had seen this figure in the window. And so Enrique, he kind of just looked at all of his friends, and then he looked back in the direction of the church and this window, which again he couldn't see because the fog was blocking it out. And so Enrique just tells himself, okay, there's no way that I just saw some dark figure moving around this abandoned church. You know, that must have been my imagination. I'm totally fine. And so he turned back to his friends, and he could tell they were not going to let it go until he touched the stone. And so he said, fine, and he walked up and he touched the stone. And immediately, as soon as his hand made contact with that stone, everything seemed to change. The air around Enrique got cooler, and the stone itself started to warm up. And as this happened, Enrique, whose hand was still on the stone, began to think, wow, I could do this for hours. I could just stay here and leave my hand on the stone. I mean, this is amazing. But then somewhere buried deep in his mind, Enrique began telling himself, get away from the stone. Take your hand away. Get away right now. And so finally, Enrique did yank his hand away, and right away, all those feelings he was having as he touched the stone disappeared. The air went back to normal. He did not feel compelled to touch the stone, and he just kind of was left thinking, what just happened?
Hey listeners, big news for true crime lovers. You can now enjoy this podcast ad-free on Amazon Music with your Prime membership. Listen to all episodes of my podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries and MrBallen's Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, along with a huge collection of top true crime podcasts, completely ad-free. No more wading through cliffhangers or dealing with ads, because let's be honest, ads shouldn't be the most nerve-wracking part of true crime. To start your ad-free listening journey, download the Amazon Music app for free, or head to amazon.com/ballen. That's amazon.com/BALLEN. Dive into uninterrupted true crime stories today. Hey, it's Mr. Ballen. For the first time, my show, Medical Mysteries, has joined forces with Redacted for a special episode. A redacted medical mystery uncovers how routine surgery leads to classified government operations. Listen now on the Medical Mysteries or Redacted feeds, or search A Redacted Medical Mystery wherever you get your podcasts.
And so Enrique's wife, Anna, along with Jorge, they were both grinning at Enrique, waiting for him to tell them about what it was like to touch the cyst stone. But behind them, Sophia, Jorge's girlfriend, she was not happy. She was the only one who had not touched the cyst stone. And so she spoke up and said, guys, let's get away from the cyst stone. I don't want to continue to tempt evil spirits, okay? Let's just go. And so Jorge threw his arm around Sophia and told her to lighten up, and then said, come on, let's do some more exploring. And so Jorge took Sophia's hand, and he continued walking down the main road in the direction of the church, and Enrique's wife, Anna, she quickly followed right after them, kind of running to keep up, like she was a kid who was excited about what they were doing. But Enrique, he just stayed put for an extra second. Because even though he had told himself that, whatever he saw in the window was nothing, he could not help the fact that as soon as he touched that cistone, he felt different. There was something off about the stone, and really there seemed to be something off about this whole village, which by this point was now completely enveloped in fog. They were totally covered. Now, Enrique at this point did just want to leave La Musara. He didn't want to be there anymore. The place was totally creeping him out. But he didn't want to be a party pooper, and so he turned and continued walking down the main road after his friends and his wife. And after he walked a little ways, the fog parted enough that he could see the pond full of these very loud croaking frogs, as well as the church and that window where he had seen or supposedly seen this dark figure, but the window was empty. And Enrique was relieved to see that his friends clearly had not stopped at the church. They had not tried to go in. They had gone behind the church into the cemetery. Enrique did not want to go inside of the church because even though, again, he had told himself that, that figure wasn't real, it wasn't really in the window, still there was a part of him that wanted to stay far away from this building. But after Enrique walked past the pond and began side-skirting the church to get to the cemetery, he just stopped and turned and actually faced the window, kind of like involuntarily. He was looking at the window where this dark figure had been. And again, it's empty, there's nothing there. But Enrique felt like something was pulling him towards this window. And so without saying anything to his friends, who aren't really paying attention to Enrique, they're kind of just walking around the cemetery, Enrique walked right up to this window. He's right in front of it, he's looking inside, and now he can see into the actual church. And it's totally ruined inside, but he can see where the pews used to be on the ground, and he could also see where the pulpit used to be, where the priest would give mass. And as Enrique stood there staring into the church, he kept leaning closer and closer and closer into the church until finally he felt like he really wanted to move away and get away from the church, but it was like he couldn't. He just kept getting pulled into this opening. And then as this was happening, the sound of the frogs got louder and louder until Enrique felt like he was totally consumed by these frogs. Meanwhile, just around the corner of the church and back in the cemetery, Anna, Jorge, and Sophia were kind of laughing and walking around the cemetery, reading the different headstones, when at some point, Anna, Enrique's wife, just happened to look up when she realized Enrique was not there with them. And so Anna, she walked over to the gate of the cemetery and she looked up along the side of the church, and there was Enrique kind of leaning forward into this window looking into the church. And so Anna, she yelled out to him a couple of times, but Enrique did not even notice her or acknowledge her. He just continued leaning forward, looking in this window. And finally, Anna got right up next to Enrique and she actually shook his shoulder. And when she did that, Enrique kind of snapped out of it and turned and looked at her, but didn't say anything. He just had this totally confused look on his face. And Anna, she looks up at her husband and she's like, "Come on, come into the cemetery. That's where everyone is. Come on." And then Anna turned and skipped towards the cemetery. And once Anna was back in the cemetery, she just got right back to walking around and looking at all the different headstones. And at some point, as she was looking at one particular headstone, she took a few steps back to get a better look at it, and she accidentally bumped into another headstone, a big cross that had a line drawn across it, and it fell to the ground and it broke. Jorge and Sophia heard the sound of the stone breaking in half, and they turned and looked at Anna, and they kind of quickly understood what had happened. And Jorge, he just started laughing at her, and he said, "Oh boy, now you've upset the evil spirits in this town. You better put that back together." Now, Anna was trying to make light of this, but she was totally panicking and did not like the fact that she had just desecrated a gravesite in a potentially haunted town. And so she began picking up the headstone and trying to put the stone back on top, but it was no use. It was totally broken. And so as Anna continued to fumble with this headstone, and as Jorge continued to laugh and harass her about all the evil spirits that were going to attack her because of what she did, Jorge's girlfriend, Sophia, who was right next to him, she started getting on edge, and she said, "Hey, Jorge, is it true that this place is haunted? I mean, really, is this actually a haunted town? I mean, what's the deal?" And Jorge, at this point, he stops laughing at Anna, and he turns to Sophia, and he goes, "Yeah, I think this place really is haunted." And then he would tell them the story of how La Musara came to be known as a haunted town. Back in October of 1873, there was a civil war happening in this part of Spain. and one of the rival armies was using the caves in the mountainside kind of near La Musara as sort of makeshift field hospitals for their wounded. And one night, a very famous general named Cercos was wounded in battle. He was brought into one of these caves, and that was where he died. Now, Cercos was a beloved leader, and so the people inside of this cave really wanted to give him a proper burial, but they knew they had to keep his death a secret. Because if it got out to the rest of the men that their leader had died, it would be totally demoralizing and it would really give their enemies a victory. And so the 6 people inside of this cave, they built a coffin and placed Cercos inside of it. And then early the next morning, when it was still dark out, these 6 carried the coffin with Cercos inside of it up into La Musara, and they buried him secretly in the cemetery behind the church. Weeks later, 5 armed rival soldiers climbed up the mountain into La Musara to look for General Cercos. They didn't know that he had died in that battle. In fact, really, besides those 6 people that saw him die and secretly buried him, nobody knew he was dead. And so these soldiers actually thought Cercos was hiding out in La Musara. And so these soldiers began busting into all the civilians' homes in La Musara and ripping them apart, looking for this general, and they'd send the people out into the streets and tell them they're going to kill them unless they give up information about where this general is. And finally, after about an hour of this, an elderly man who lived in La Musara had just had enough, and he stepped forward and he told the rival soldiers that General Cercos was dead, that he was buried in the cemetery behind their church. But the rival soldiers didn't believe the man. They said, okay, show us proof. But the elderly man said, well, I don't know exactly where he was buried in the cemetery. I just heard that's where he was buried. And so the soldier said, okay, get everybody over to the cemetery right now. And so all the townspeople made their way over to the cemetery and the soldiers followed them. And then once they were there, the soldiers demanded that the townspeople begin basically digging up all the graves to find Cercos. And as the townspeople began to dig, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder until finally the leader of these rival soldiers actually stepped away from all the chaos happening in the cemetery and walked over to the pond and began firing his gun into the water to get the frogs to stop. But they wouldn't. They actually only got louder and louder. And so the leader of these rival soldiers finally just gives up on trying to quiet down these frogs, and he turns around and walks back into the cemetery, and he finds all the townspeople have stopped digging. They've basically dug up every grave, and they haven't found Cercos, and they're just kind of waiting to see what happens next. But the leader, as he looked across this graveyard, he noticed there was one grave that very conspicuously had not been touched. Everything around it had been dug up, but not this. No one had touched that grave. And so the leader said, go, dig that one up. But immediately the townspeople kind of took a step back and acted like, no way, we're not going near that grave. And so finally, a townsperson actually stepped forward and said to the leader of these rival soldiers that that grave contained this old woman who had died recently, who everyone suspected of being a witch. And so it was dangerous to try to dig her up. But the rival soldiers did not care at all about this. They just raised their guns and demanded the townspeople dig that grave up immediately. And so they would. They would go over, they would unearth this coffin, and then the rival soldiers would pop open the lid. And as soon as it was open, everybody went silent. Because this woman, who had died weeks earlier, looked totally preserved. She was laying on her back and her skin was very pale, but it had not begun to rot yet. Even her cheeks still had a kind of pinkish hue to them, and her lips were open partway, as if she had been buried mid-sentence. But what really had startled the group into silence was this woman's eyes were wide open when they opened up this coffin. It looked like she was looking directly at all of them. And so after a couple of seconds of the silence from seeing this woman for the first time, the townspeople began to cry and scream and back up away from this coffin. And the rival soldiers, they were startled too by this woman's appearance, but they were more angry than anything else, because by finding this woman in this grave, it meant they had not found the general. And so out of frustration, the rival soldiers grabbed this old woman's body, this witch's body, and they pulled her out of her grave, they strung her up to a tree, and they just sat there shooting at her constantly until her body had basically been obliterated by all the bullets.
And then finally, when the soldiers stopped shooting, they realized everything had gone quiet. Just a second earlier, the cacophony of these frogs croaking in the pond that had been so loud it was like totally overwhelming had now completely ceased, and it was like the town had gone absolutely still. And this stillness and quietness was so unsettling for these soldiers that they actually just turned and fled right there without saying a word to the townspeople. And then once the soldiers were all gone, the townspeople got to work reburying their dead. And at some point, one of the townspeople jumped into the grave where the witch had been, and when they landed in the dirt at the bottom, their foot actually sunk down an extra foot. They had landed on something hollow and crashed into it. And what it was another coffin. There was another coffin buried below this woman's that the soldiers had not seen. And this secret coffin belonged to General Serkos. When those 6 people had secretly buried General Serkos, they had just placed his coffin at the bottom of an open grave that was about to be filled with somebody else's coffin. They put it in, they covered up his coffin with enough dirt that no one could see it, and then the next day, the townspeople lowered the witch in her coffin into that grave without realizing General Serkos was below it, and then they filled it in, and then they placed a headstone on her grave. But because they thought she was a witch, they decided not to write her name on the headstone. Instead, they just etched a horizontal line across her headstone. And so after this incident with the rival soldiers desecrating this woman's grave and her body, La Musara was never the same. People in the town began dying left and right, and their soil went bad, so they couldn't plant any crops, and then all these insects came through the town, and then all these plagues of illnesses and diseases came through. And so it wasn't long before La Musara had developed this reputation of being cursed. And by the 1950s, that curse apparently had driven the last few people out, officially making it a ghost town.
Hey listeners, MrBallen here. What if I told you that some of the strangest, darkest, and most mysterious stories happening right now are all connected to what might be the biggest crime of our generation? You know I'm always on the hunt for the most chilling and perplexing tales out there. Well, I've discovered a new podcast that uncovers real-world mysteries unfolding right now, much like how another Ballen Studios podcast, Redacted Declassified Mysteries, brings hidden government secrets to light. And it's called Lawless Planet. Host Zach Goldbaum reveals how shocking tales of murder, cover-ups, and mysterious deaths are all part of something bigger, the systematic destruction of our planet. From activists who vanish in the Amazon to whistleblowers uncovering billion-dollar environmental crimes, these aren't just stories about the environment. They're real-life thrillers about people caught between powerful forces willing to kill to keep their secrets buried. Follow Lawless Planet on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to new episodes of Lawless Planet early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus. Hey, it's MrBallen. I'm excited to tell you about something special. For the first time, my show, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, has joined forces with Redacted, Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna, to tell a story so complex it required our combined storytelling styles. This special episode is called A Redacted Medical Mystery. In it, unexplained symptoms after a routine surgery quickly unravel into something much darker, leading straight to classified government operations hidden for decades. To listen and uncover the truth alongside us, head to either the MrBallen's Medical Mysteries or Redacted show pages right now. Or search for A Redacted Medical Mystery in the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're fascinated by unexplained medical stories, well, stick around on Medical Mysteries. Every week, we dive deep into cases that will leave you questioning everything you know about the human body. And if government conspiracies are more your style, Redacted is your go-to for stories that unravel secrets never meant to see the light of day. Remember, you can listen to both shows early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus.
After Jorge wrapped up the story, Anna was just horrified looking straight down at the ground, because it would turn out the gravestone that she had accidentally knocked over and broken, well, it had a horizontal line etched across the middle of it. It was the witch's headstone. That was the one she had broken. And so suddenly feeling totally spooked, Anna was about to yell to Jorge and Sofia that she wants to leave now, when she happened to glance over at the base of one of the cemetery walls, and she saw the perfect bloody milk cap mushroom, the exact type she knew her husband was looking for. And so Anna walked over, she picked this mushroom, and she turned around to show it to Enrique, but Enrique was not in the cemetery. And so right away, Anna thought, wait, did my husband ever actually follow me back down into the cemetery after I saw him by the church? She couldn't remember. She thought he followed her, but she wasn't sure. And so Anna yelled out for Enrique, but he never called back. And so she turned and looked over at Sofia and Jorge, who she could barely see through the fog. And she asked them, hey, have you seen my husband? Is he in here? Did you see where he went? And they both said, no, we have no idea. And so Anna, who at this point was now really starting to panic because this whole situation in La Musara was getting pretty spooky for her. And so she just dropped the mushroom and took off running out of the cemetery. Now, Sofia and Jorge did not really know what was going on. They didn't understand the urgency that Anna was feeling to find Enrique. And so they saw her take off to go find Enrique, and they just kind of casually walked on after her. And when they turned the corner and they exited the cemetery and began walking basically alongside the church, now again, the visibility is terrible from all this fog. As they moved along, they couldn't see Anna or Enrique, but they could hear Anna calling out for Enrique over and over again. And as they moved, Sofia and Jorge, they would see these shadows moving around in the fog. And they would think it was Enrique or Anna, but as they got up to where these shadows were, there'd be nothing there. And so Sofia, she began grabbing tighter and tighter onto Jorge's arm, and Jorge, who had been kind of joking about how this place was evil, was also now starting to feel a little bit spooked about what was going on. And so they began walking a little bit faster and faster in the direction of Anna's voice. And as Sofia and Jorge got closer and closer to Anna, the sound of the frogs in that pond began to get louder and louder and louder until Jorge and Sofia could barely hear Anna over the sound of these frogs. And then just like that, the frogs stopped. And all Sofia and Jorge could hear was the sound now of Anna crying. Now, Jorge and Sofia could not actually see Anna because of the fog, but they walked in the direction of her voice, and they ultimately found Anna crouched down with her back to them right in the spot where Enrique had previously been standing staring in that church window. And so Sofia and Jorge, they walked up to Anna and they reached down and they put their hands on her shoulder. And when Anna turned around, she was clutching Enrique's wicker basket containing all of his mushrooms. And with tears coming down Anna's eyes, she would say to her friends, "He's gone." Anna, Jorge, and Sofia would spend the next hour searching in vain for Enrique in La Musara. Remember, there's no visibility from the fog, and now it's getting dark, and so it's really hard to conduct a search for someone. And so after this hour was up, even though they had no idea where Enrique was or what happened to him, the friends decided that their best and really only move was to leave and go tell authorities. And when they did that, a massive search was launched all around La Musara for the next week. But despite this huge effort, nobody ever found any trace of Enrique. He just vanished, leaving behind that wicker basket that Anna had found. And so after this week of searching, the authorities finally called it off and told Anna that, most likely her husband must have wandered off and died somewhere, and at some point, hikers will likely discover his body. But Anna could not accept this conclusion, and so she continued to go back to La Musara to look for Enrique. And in January of 1992, so 3 months after Enrique had gone missing, Anna, Sofia, and Jorge returned to La Musara to do another one of these additional searches. And during the search, the friends were walking past the church and they passed by that same window where Enrique had been standing looking inside and also where his basket had been found by Anna. And the three friends, as they passed by, they happened to see into the church, and down on the main floor where the pews used to be and where the pulpit used to be, there were these 6 dark figures wearing robes standing in a circle, not appearing to be doing anything but just standing there. And immediately, Anna actually was really annoyed because she figured this must be a group of ghost hunters that were out here looking for something paranormal, because after Enrique went missing, his story made the news largely because he went missing in a town that's long been regarded as being haunted. And so because of his case, you had all these people coming to La Musara to go find ghosts or find whatever happened to Enrique.
And so Anna, who was deeply offended by all these people who were coming out to La Musara to look for ghosts, because for Anna, this is not a game. Her husband really went missing here. So she goes right up to the window to tell these 6 people in robes off, get the hell out of here and have some respect. But when she went to the window and was about to yell in, one of the robed figures suddenly turned and looked up at Anna. And immediately Anna backed up because this clearly was not some ghost hunter. Because the hooded figure had no face. It was just a dark hole looking back up at Anna. But even though there were no eyes, Anna could tell this thing, this entity, was staring right at her. But before Anna, Sophia, or Jorge could react to what they were seeing inside of this church, from behind them, they suddenly heard this unbelievably loud galloping sound, like all these horses were charging towards them. And at the same time, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder. And so Anna, Sophia, and Jorge turned around to see what was going on, kind of expecting to see, a cavalry approaching or something. But there was nothing. All they saw was the fog on the road. And so the 3 friends turned back around to look back into the church, and now these 6 hooded figures were gone. And so suddenly thinking that these figures had left the church and they were coming to get them, the 3 friends did not wait any longer. They turned and just sprinted out of La Musara. Enrique was never found. His wife, his friends, the authorities, they still have no idea what happened to him. There have also been several other people who have gone missing in La Musara, and they too have never been found.